Hey everybody, thank you very much for tuning in to part 3 of episode 300 of Last Born in the Wilderness. I am your host, Patrick Farnsworth. So this section is going to be dealing with a few themes. The main theme, the overarching theme of this is around COVID, around the pandemic. Of course, we're still in the middle of this pandemic, globally speaking. In the United States, we're in a bit of a different situation than we were about a year and a half when this thing started. But the ways in which this pandemic has highlighted the disparities of wealth, the inherent precarities of the global capitalist system, of the various ways that nation states as entities are often very ill-equipped and incapable of reacting to global crises like these in a comprehensive and coherent way. Like, every country is different, and actually the first interview I'm going to be featuring here in this section will address that a little bit, but nonetheless, like, the way that this pandemic has highlighted the deep flaws in the ways in which the whole global socioeconomic system operates, the deep flaws in each of these nation states and how these states react to crisis, that became starkly apparent over the past year and a half. It was already there. These disparities, these precarities, and so on have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. But especially within the modern moment, to see the ways in which the states that we are all citizens of, that we are all members of, and so on, see the way that these states have reacted to this virus and the centers of capital, of power, have reacted to it, has been very illuminating for people. And because of that, because of the disparities that have been highlighted, there's been so many reactions that have come out of it. As a collective body, we have reacted to this virus in so many different ways, in some ways that are very beautiful, but also in ways that were very disturbing, have been very disturbing. As this pandemic burns its way through the global population, to see the psychopaths at the helm, how they dealt with it or chose not to deal with it, was very illuminating, for me at least, and for a lot of people, just to see how, oh, like, this is how you're going to deal with this crisis. Well, how are we going to deal with other more pressing crises on the horizon that are playing out currently, like the climate crisis? That is the looming crisis. That is the big crisis and the ecological crisis as a whole. And I've covered that obviously in the first section of the series. We can see how these governments and these various centers of power, this is how these institutions and those that run them are going to deal with these things in the future as well. They're going to take advantage of these crises in order to extract more capital out of you. They're going to use it as a way to reformulate the economy and reformulate our collective lives, our social lives, in a way to benefit the system, right? Certainly, there's a dip in the economy or there's a certain economic loss that occurs with these types of crises, but they're often used as a pretext to maximize more extraction and to maximize the further pervasive expansion of the global capitalist system and the social relations that come with them. So it's been interesting to see how this crisis has played out. It's been fascinating and disturbing. And I really want to also highlight something here and say this, which is this section and the next two sections are going to be very connected. They're going to really bleed into each other as far as how I'm presenting them, because I really wanted to start with the pandemic, because from the pandemic we saw so many things occur. One of them was the uprisings that emerged last year in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, which I'll be getting to in the next section. I don't want to say that the uprisings occurred because of the pandemic. It was obviously sparked by the viral video of George Floyd being murdered by that white police officer, Derek Chauvin, obviously. And of course, that's tied to the deeper traumas, the deeper roots of racial violence and oppression and white supremacy that has existed in this country since its foundation. That is most definitely the point of it. But nonetheless, pandemics tend to change the societies that they happen to in such a particular way where the likelihood of uprisings occurring increases. It creates a certain level of instability, of anxiety, of willingness to take risks, and so on. Actually, Silvia Federici talks about, and I'll be featuring that in the next section of this during the uprisings. We'll talk about that. But the pandemic itself produces certain types of conditions which lead to these types of uprisings and so on. So I just want to acknowledge this, that all of this is connected. And that's actually the point of this series, is to draw connections between these various subjects that I've been fascinated by, that I've been drawn to talk about on here, and to try to make sense of them, at least for myself and hopefully for you, the listener. Also, I just want to say that in this particular section, while I do talk about COVID, I was trying to figure out as well how to talk about the pervasiveness of misinformation and just general ignorance surrounding public health that has been really infuriating and frustrating to see. As soon as the pandemic hit, we started to see reactions to it, of course, and one of the major reactions was this sort of reactionary right-wing victim complex kind of play out, right? Like people associating wearing masks in public, socially distancing, and so on. All of these things that are really practical things to do during a pandemic such as this one, but were reacted to in such a way where people felt like their rights are being taken away, like this is fascism and tyranny. And of course, that was one of the first protests that started happening once the pandemic and the reactions to the pandemic occurred in the US. It wasn't people asking the right questions. People weren't going to their government and saying, hey, we acknowledge the severity of this pandemic and we really want to make sure it doesn't spread to the most vulnerable people in the population, so we're going to do our part. That would be a pro-social response, right? No, we just want everything to go back to the way it was, and this isn't a big deal, and we're going to gaslight you and minimize it, and we're going to pretend like this virus doesn't exist and it's some conspiracy. All the weird-ass, contradictory, cognitive dissonance-esque conspiracy theories that emerged out of this, which really emboldened this sort of reactionary perspective to these things where, some of the most psychopathic elements of our society were like, yeah, like, fuck everybody. Who gives a shit about your grandma? Who gives a shit about the most vulnerable people in the population that can die from this? All of this shit, right? It just became unbearable for so many people to acknowledge that we are a part of a collective and that we have to act as responsible citizens of a collective. It's not about listening to the state. It's not about listening to the government. It's just acknowledging basic scientific facts, material realities that we're a part of, and that viruses are a part of that. And that public health is really something that we should take seriously. And that pandemics emerge when we have these sort of pervasive civilizations that spread into more and more environments and destroy the natural world as much as we are. That's just a fundamental component of a civilization that is as ecocidal as ours is. People are so fucking disconnected from that reality that as soon as something like this emerges, it has to be a man-made thing. It has to come from human beings. Like, it's just impossible to comprehend that the natural world would react to our ecocide. Again, it's a complex subject, but I just really wanted to highlight the ways in which this pandemic really raised the temperature. It really highlighted the ways in which people conceive of reality in completely different ways. And it really generated more divisiveness and division in our society, in particular the United States, because of the decades and decades of anti-intellectualism, of the ways in which, say, the Republican Party and the right wing in particular has embraced this sort of anti-science perspective, which has really been pervasive in the society at large now. And so people just don't trust science. And I understand there's political elements to this. I understand that scientists and the whole medical establishment is corrupt in its own very particular way. I totally understand that. There are reasons to be distrustful of institutions. But the fact is, there is an absolute reality to this pandemic that just cannot be ignored. And closing your eyes and plugging your ears and pretending that it'll go away isn't going to work either. So this pandemic required us to be responsible in a way that we just haven't been in a very long time as a society. And we fucking failed and on so many levels. And it was really instructive of like what to expect again in the future as more crises come down the pipeline. And so the first segment of an interview I would like to feature, I actually recorded this with John Feffer. This was released in March of 2020. So this was the first interview that I had conducted about the coronavirus pandemic. This was just as things were beginning to shift and change around that time. And John is the second time on the podcast, but John is director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. And in the interview, we discuss the initial impacts of the coronavirus outbreak, the effects that it was already having on the global economic system, And he laid that out in a really excellent article he published called Will the Coronavirus Kill Globalization? And that was published at Foreign Policy in Focus and Counterpunch. And what I wrote here was there are plenty of adequate resources currently available on the nature of the coronavirus, including how it spreads, the common symptoms to look out for, and the demographics most likely to suffer and potentially die from it. What needs to be explored a bit more is the impacts this global pandemic has had and will continue to have on the global economic system as numerous governments respond to this public health emergency. So I asked John to provide some insights into the impacts this virus has had on globalization at large, with whole sectors of the global supply chain experiencing dramatic shortages as numerous economic sectors shut down, impeding international trade into the foreseeable future. As the impacts of this pandemic play out over the next several months, and I also note here that this is just the beginning, I was correct, unfortunately. The quote, house of cards, that is the global capitalist system, is revealing how precarious this whole arrangement really is, with systemic issues starkly presenting themselves as medical staff struggle to adequately respond to the influx of infected patients in hospitals and clinics around the globe, and as stock markets crash. John compares the responses of each nation grappling with this crisis with some of the harshest criticisms saved for the United States and the Trump administration in their astounding incompetency and lack of preparedness in the face of this crisis. And he also provides some historical context pointing to the pandemic of 1918, which has been called the Spanish flu, which preceded the end of World War I, which killed up to 50 million people. Okay, so that gives you a bit of an idea of what we discuss as a whole in that interview. I am going to just be featuring, of course, a segment from that, but it'll give you an idea of what we were thinking at that time as the pandemic was just starting to affect the global economic system. How, a year and a half on, we're still experiencing a lot of the same issues. Something as seemingly small as a virus can have such a profound effect on the way that we exist within the global economic system. Yeah, you write here in your article, the global spread of a new pathogen has exposed the fragility of modern life. As it moves around the world, the coronavirus has compromised the circulatory system of globalization, dramatically reducing the international flow of money, goods, and people. The disease has done so rather economically by infecting fewer than 100,000 people so far. Extrapolation and fear have done most of the work for it. And you do compare this to, say, other pathogens like the Ebola virus, which has something like a 50% mortality rate versus the coronavirus, which is somewhere between, 1 to 3 to 4%, I guess they're sort of estimating. What I find, I guess, fascinating is that, like you said here, it's not that it's not a big deal, but it's based just around the way the whole global economy has been structured. Something like this has had a huge impact on international travel, on the trading of goods between various nation states. So, I mean, what to you does this speak to as far as maybe some of the inherent weaknesses or flaws in how globalization has manifested in the past several decades?
Well, obviously, as I said in the article, the coronavirus has exposed how fragile our modern life is. The modern life is dependent on globalization, and it's also based on trade-offs which, generally speaking, we've been happy to accommodate. But when the losses outweigh the gains, then suddenly we turn our back on this system. So I'll give you an example. In Europe, in the European Union, there has been a trade-off on this question of the free flow of goods, services, and people throughout the European space. And there are a lot of advantages to that. Obviously, Europeans are thrilled about the opportunity to go work in other countries, and they're happy that there is some savings connected to goods traveling without any real barriers within the European space. But there are some challenges. There are some downsides to that. One, of course, is that organized crime can proliferate within that space, sending stuff around rather easily from the Balkans on up, drugs, guns, etc. And also, there has been, just with the free flow of folks within the European Union, stresses put on economies and stresses put on communities that have led to backlash, which we, of course, saw with Brexit in the UK, which was largely in response to the huge number of Eastern Europeans who were coming to the country. It really wasn't a response to the migrants coming from war-torn countries or North Africa or even former British colonies. It was the real dramatic upturn in numbers coming from Poland, Romania, etc., that created that backlash. But then if you add on top of that the so-called migrant crisis, that suddenly, puts a stress on these kind of essential components of European integration, which is prefaced on the free flow of people and goods and currency. On top of that, you throw a pandemic, and suddenly, whereas you had only a couple of countries throwing up walls before, Hungary, for instance, throwing up a wall between itself and Serbia to keep out immigrants, or say walls within Eastern European countries to wall off Roma population. Suddenly everyone wants to throw up a wall because they're suddenly scared of anybody coming from outside, because they might be carrying with them a pathogen. So this suggests that, it doesn't take much to become a tipping point, if you will. Already there's enough dissatisfaction with the downsides, or what are perceived to be the downsides of globalization, that all you need is a little bit more for a government which hitherto had been, pro-globalization, to decide that maybe we do need that travel ban, and maybe on top of that, we should really think more deeply about how connected our economy is globally if something like this comes along and it leads to such a dramatic drop in our economic performance.
So I guess that what you're speaking to is it's a compounding thing. It's like there's all these other factors that are there, and then you throw in a pandemic, and it's like the whole thing starts to really come down to some degree. Maybe not completely, of course, but it's like there's already tensions between nations and borders and whatnot, and now it's like, oh, now there's a pandemic, so it's even more so. Is that what you're saying? I guess it kind of adds to the problem.
Yeah, and to give another historical example, we had a kind of first major wave of modern globalization at the end of the 19th century, going into the early 20th century, which was made possible by steamships, the telegraph, train travel, which really knit together the world in a way that it hadn't previously been. Of course, there had been the Silk Road and trading routes, of course, but in the modern sense, it really was a question of an enormous upgrade in technology and in reducing or contracting the distance between people internationally. All of that comes to a halt with World War I, which is this. You could, aside from all of the kind of geopolitical disagreements that were involved in World War I, you could see it as simply one enormous backlash against globalization, that modern globalization, backlash of nationalist movements throughout Europe at the time and in other parts of the world, groups that were dissatisfied with this contraction of distance. They did not want to be so close to people on the other side of the world. And they were willing to go to war in order to preserve their sovereignty, to preserve their distinctness as a nation. And World War I, effectively destroyed that first wave of modern globalization. But the crowning touch on that was really the pandemic that took place at the end of the war, between approximately 1918 and 1920, the Spanish flu, which killed as many people as World War I did. But also really exposed the fragility of this global project, because it was spread by people traveling around, mostly soldiers returning from the war, but not just soldiers. And suddenly people became suspicious of open borders, of open travel. So, if you will, this was a similar kind of uh, phenomenon in which you had the kind of ground already prepared for a major kind of step backward from globalization, and then on top of it, a pandemic that basically said, "You're right, folks. This is not such a great project, and you should think twice about, bringing the world so close together." It's a reminder that goes all the way back into history. Pandemics, basically, many of them begin because of agriculture and the first cities, when you had livestock and people living in close proximity to one another, and diseases jumping back and forth between them. That too should have been a reminder. Hey, maybe you shouldn't be so close to your pig or your horse. Mm-hmm. That's what the pandemic was telling humanity. And likewise, in 1918, the pandemic's message, as interpreted by many people, was, this global project of smushing people together, of reducing the distance between them, is not necessarily such a good idea.
Mm. I think that there's maybe a fine line, or maybe it's not so fine, maybe it's something else. But, the first response, like socially, I guess, that I was seeing, that everybody here was seeing, is, of course, the virus first became known as the Wuhan virus because of where it was at in China. And immediately we started seeing people freaking out about Chinese people. There was this sort of stoking of xenophobia and racism towards Asians, and in the United States in particular, where we are at right now. So in a way, it's like the pandemic itself is stoking and bringing to the surface a lot of maybe sentiments and ideas that really haven't gone away. And like you mentioned with World War I, it really brought up a lot of those, I guess, ultra-nationalist feelings that people were starting to feel during that time. So it's like the pandemic, I think, it's being interpreted in all these different ways. But one way that I find really disturbing that it is being interpreted is there's a particular group of people that are creating this virus, and we need to keep them out. I think that needs to be spoken to a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, it would be lovely if the virus magnified our best qualities as a such that and this does happen. Obviously, some places where communities come together and they really provide assistance and resources to the most vulnerable people in the community. In this case, older folks and people with underlying conditions. And like I said, that has happened in some places. But unfortunately, in an atmosphere of fear, and in an atmosphere in which resources are not unlimited, the virus tends to magnify the worst aspects. And some of those aspects are, simply xenophobia. This thing comes from outside. As Donald Trump, the president, said, this is not an American disease. This was early on, before it became an American disease. It is ultimately, I think a lot of people want there to be some underlying reason why this pandemic is spreading, and for them, the reason is other people. Other people are the problem, and if we simply keep our distance from them, as an America First foreign policy suggests, then we wouldn't have these problems. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it's reinforcing that kind of philosophy.
So I recorded that, as I mentioned before, I recorded that at the very beginning of the pandemic, this interview with John. I think John was pretty on the money as far as what he was expecting to occur and what was already beginning to occur. It's pretty amazing. This globalized capitalist system is so fragile in so many ways. I mean, it's two things simultaneously. It's very easily disrupted, but also it's very adaptable to the circumstances. It will find a way to continue to function and work. It may be slowed down, it may lose some elements of productivity, but nonetheless, it'll figure itself out. It was interesting to hear that from John and to sort of reflect on the ways that globalization itself is kind of a risky business when it comes to pandemics and diseases, because we've had this happen before. This happened in 1918 into 1920 with the so-called Spanish flu, that whole influenza pandemic that occurred at that time. So globalization itself is producing the conditions for the very easy spread, the rapid spread of various contagions. So in this time frame, I was doing quite a few interviews. Of course, I was feeling, I think, a bit anxious, and I felt this sort of dread or this sense of uncertainty about what was going to happen. I recall at that time feeling, even before everything started really kicking off, that there was just this shift in the air. There was this indescribable feeling that something really big was about to happen. And, I think it was definitely the pandemic itself that was producing that feeling. But I think because of the things that occurred during this time as well, the uprisings in the United States, the far right reaction to that, a president that was attempting to basically overthrow a democratic election, all of the things that came out of this time wasn't because of the pandemic specifically, but I think the ground was very fertile for this type of disruption. And I think the pandemic really enhanced that quality, at least in the United States. Someone that I had interviewed, actually two people that I had interviewed at this time, was Valkyrie and Reed Wildermuth. And I really just want to feature a segment of the conversation with Ali. So Ali and Reed are both the co-founders of Gods and Radicals Press. I've worked with Gods and Radicals. I published my book through them. Both Ali and Reed had moved to Europe, but Ali in particular had moved to France. And she's very good at articulating some of the cultural tendencies that U.S. Americans have. And I think now that she's lived outside the United States for some time, she can see it with a certain lens. It's really important that I think we listen to people like Ali, because not only is she very articulate and very intelligent, very good at explaining things, but because of the position she's in, geographically at least, she's able to observe what's going on and compare it to other places like France, for instance, and compare like how U.S. Americans are dealing with something like a pandemic. I mean, if y'all remember at the very beginning of this thing, people were hoarding things, people were going to various department stores and grocery stores and just buying all the toilet paper. Like, it was very strange. Like, people weren't buying things that maybe they necessarily needed as much. They were going for toilet paper. I think Ali, in this segment I'm going to be featuring here, does a really good job of explaining that moment in time when she was observing what U.S. Americans were up to. From the very get-go, people were resisting even believing in this virus. They were wanting to resist these so-called lockdown measures and mask mandates and guidelines around social distancing, and very belligerent, entitled, privileged people in this country.
I've been thinking, like being related, someone shared like an infographic the other day about the way that the Black Plague, the first round in the 1350s had transmitted. And actually that was one of the things that I was really reflecting on, because it showed it, that the infographics we're seeing now on how it's transmitting are by the day. This infographic was by the year, over a 7-year period, which it took to come from the Far East. And that too, they I mean, they can't prove it, but they think it came from China, from Mongolia, and it came over trade routes. But, it didn't hit London until 3 years later. It didn't hit Ireland and Wales until 2 years after that. Whereas we're now seeing, just over a course of 3 months, it being in the majority of countries in the world. My one, I mean, I was saw these folks in New Hampshire are suing the state for banning large gatherings. They've apparently decided that instead of live free or die, their motto is going to be live free and die. And my attitude toward that is, if it was only themselves, I'd say go for it. Go for it. And I feel that way about all the conspiracy theorists, about all, I think there's a difference between the people who are just kind of in denial because they can't comprehend, and then the active conspiracy theorists. And frankly, the latter, again, that's an American tendency. Like, we're not seeing that over here. That's the legacy of decades worth of people going to YouTube as their primary source of information, the Alex Jones effect, the flat earthers, combined with, there's always been a certain American resistance to accepting scientific reality amongst when it comes to things like pandemics. The Spanish flu pandemic, America was very unique in being the only, industrialized country in the world where you still had people in 1918 denying germ theory because their preachers were telling them that it was God's will, right? But my only, and again, if it was just them, there's this very angry part of me that's like, go ahead, like, that's the cleansing we need. But the problem is, it's not just them. They will inadvertently infect innocent people, and not just the elderly. That's something that I think Americans are really starting to realize with the new statistics coming out. Like, the elderly are disproportionately affected, but children are affected. Everyone is affected, and it's the irresponsibility of just very few that can lead to the infection of a huge amount of innocent people. And that's, and again, it's just, especially in the US, it's just a matter of selfishness. And it's just kind of, I'm just looking at this culmination of, so many different cultural tendencies that, those of us who know how to critically think have always seen as toxic, and they are all colliding in this perfect storm right now. And I'm just, I would like to think, I listened to what Reed's saying, I would like to think that that's a lesson we're going to understand in terms of civilization. But especially for Americans, I fear that won't be the case. A different kind of cult, over here, there was a really influential book that came out about 3 years ago that was a French bestseller called Collapsology. And it became a very, very popular strain of thought here that you find even amongst the mainstream, where, it was written by environmentalists that basically said, look, you got 20 years before everything goes to hell, and like, you better start learning how to grow your own food. And, so like the kind of like fringe ideas you'll find amongst both the far left and the far right in America was much more of a mainstream idea here that's been floated. Actually, I just read that like they're just now translating this book into English, maybe too little too late. But, so here again, I think mentally, people are a little more prepared, because the idea of something happening like this isn't just an idea that they got from Hollywood. Whereas, me as an American, like who grew up, in the 80s and 90s, I'm looking at this, I'm like, ooh, it's like Outbreak or 28 Days Later or 12 Monkeys. And I'm really glad it's not exactly like 28 Days Later, because if I find one of my friends are infected, at least I don't have to kill them immediately. That would be like even more traumatic, right? Like
immediately. That's the key word here, immediately.
Immediately. That was they had to kill them immediately. You couldn't even like tell them I'm sorry. You had to kill them immediately in order to save the planet.
Horrifying.
So at least it's not like that. But, but I do feel that there's going to, even amongst the Western world, that there's going to kind of be a cultural split between Europe and the United States in terms of lessons learned here, in terms of like the idea that, maybe we shouldn't be flying airplanes all over the world. You look at like someone like Greta Thunberg, right, who already refused to get on a plane. And, the mockery of the majority of Americans over such an idea. Whereas, I know a lot of people here who refuse to get on planes. Like that's not such a cuckoo idea when it comes to Europeans who have always been more ecologically minded, and in part because the same thing, they've always been living in much closer quarters, and they have an ancestral understanding and history of things like pandemics and of the need to be able to like live communally and, not shit in the clean water supply so that everyone else doesn't get sick. So we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think Americans have anything like a cultural memory regarding crisis like this. We don't.
Nope. That's why they're buying toilet paper.
Oh, yeah.
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 It wasn't, when I went to the store here, the baking supplies were what was gone. There was plenty of toilet paper. People are like, oh, we're going to have to make bread.
Yeah. I really have appreciated getting to know Allie over the years and to hear her perspective on things as things have unfolded throughout the past however many years, especially during this pandemic. To look at it from the outside in, the pandemic really brought out a few different things, and I'm going to be highlighting some of the positive things that the pandemic has brought out too. I will be doing that a little bit later, but I am going to be harping on the absolute immaturity and idiocy and downright selfishness of the U.S. population in general. And of course, not everyone's the same. I don't want to overly generalize. But what happened during the pandemic is it really just exposed how individualistic and atomized people's thinking is. That there's a sizable portion of the U.S. population, as well as the political establishment, that just doesn't give a fuck about other people. I mean, I've known that people in this country have been recklessly selfish for some time. But when a crisis occurs like this, with this pandemic, it exposed so much, and it really raised the temperature, so to speak, because people became so indignant and they just could not accept that they had to take on certain responsibilities as a social creature, as a citizen of a society. People just could not accept that responsibility. They reacted like children, and that's actually insulting to children. They reacted even worse than that. And it's still happening to this day. I mean, we're still seeing all this. We're still in this pandemic. It's not like it's over by any means, but things have, again, I've said this before, but things have shifted considerably over the past several months. So I am going to be featuring a few segments here that's going to be, it was difficult for me to figure out how to exactly fit these two segments in here because I felt like they really belong in this part of the episode. I felt like they belong here, and I was trying to figure out how to exactly include them, and I think they'll fit here. But because I'm harping so much on the idiocy of the U.S. population, I think it's important to talk about conspiracy theories a little bit. Because what came out of this time of great uncertainty and so on is, one, we have such a high distrust of institutions, which is understandable. I mean, I'm an anarchist, I have to say, ultimately. So I really wish that instead of us like relying upon the state to issue mandates and lockdowns and travel restrictions and all that shit, I wish instead that people just acknowledge that, hey, there's a thing called a pandemic that's occurring, and we should, as social beings, as beings who care for one another, we should abide by certain guidelines and just do that and take care of each other. That would be the preferable course that I would want for people. But we don't live in that kind of culture. We live in a culture that has been conditioned to think in a very individual way about things. I've got mine, fuck everybody else. That mentality is terrible. It's absolutely atrocious, and especially when it comes to crises like this, where it becomes incredibly apparent that we're not just these isolated islands, we're not just these individuals floating around making decisions that don't affect other people. No, we live a part of a larger body. We are a collection of organisms that are all connected to one another, and that when you have a deadly, contagious virus like this coronavirus, that your actions affect other people directly. That if you carry this virus and you spread it to someone else who then could spread it to someone who's more vulnerable, people weren't looking at it through that lens. People were looking at it like, I'm not able to do the things that I want to do anymore. And that makes me angry, and I think that that's tyranny. Right? Again, this wasn't everybody. a lot of people have been responsible. A lot of people have taken it seriously. That's very, very true. A lot of people took care of each other. We started seeing generous acts of mutual aid occur across the country. I mean, that happened too, and that has been happening. But as Ali pointed to, you've got this maybe a small percentage of people that are acting really irresponsibly, and it's affecting everybody. It's like pandemics are just one of those things where the actions of a small group of people just has a ripple effect that affects the entire population. During this time, there was, as I mentioned, a lot of distrust in institutions, and we were really seeing also Donald Trump being president. He was, of course, standing in the face of any sense of truth or anything that resembled reality. He would just make up shit. During the pandemic, he was either denying its existence, or calling it the China virus, or talking about hydrochloroquine or all these other like weird things, right? Like he was spreading misinformation so wantonly without any thought. He just didn't give a shit, right? I mean, he was a president. He had this huge podium to speak from, and he just didn't give a fuck. He just didn't give a shit, and just make it so much more difficult for those that were actually on the front lines of this, including doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers. He had no care or regard for that. So this was a time where we were really starting to see this brewing, seething anxiety and white resentment. People's grasp on reality was really beginning to slip. Where people people you might know that you might live with, people you might work with, just regular ass people that you bump into on a regular basis, who believe the most insane shit possible. And I'm talking about QAnon. And QAnon still exists. It's not like it went away, but it had its heyday for sure, leading up to the election and then immediately after the election. And I think it's important to talk about QAnon in the context of this pandemic because people became more isolated, because things were shifting so dramatically in the society. People were looking for narratives that could help make sense of what was happening. And I think that's where conspiracy theories and cultic dynamics can really emerge and become very pervasive and very persuasive for people. So I became aware of this political commentator, Jared Yates Sexton, and he's the author of several books, including most recently American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. And as I'm going to read here from the description, I first became aware of Jared and his work from his analysis of the QAnon conspiracy theory. I asked him to expound on the tenets of this alarmingly popular and increasingly pervasive belief system, which we characterize as having the attributes of a pseudo-religious cult. Its roots on the anonymous online forum 4chan, as well as the impacts this reality-bending narrative is having on contemporary politics in the United States. And I'm going to quote here from an article that he had published around that time titled "A Cult Within a Cult, QAnon Conspiracy Theories and Growing Fascism." To fully grasp what QAnon is and what it could become, we have to break down the very essence of this cult. It is a rebranding of the New World Order conspiracy theory that has held sway over American politics for the past 2 decades and a side effect of the right's war on science, education, and experts that has been waged on behalf of moneyed and powerful interests. It is a conspiracy theory that Trump and Republicans have flirted with and tacitly embraced as it scrubs clean flagrant corruption and miscarriages of justice. It has been made possible by repeated attacks on objective reality by a president, a party, and a movement that can only win elections when they are held inside a completely fabricated alternate reality wherein voters must choose between a satanic conspiracy and a party that continues to destroy democratic institutions. In short, QAnon is a conspiracy theory that legitimizes fascism. Its narrative of a system that has been so corrupted by traitors and conspirators that elections and democratic institutions themselves are unreliable means that violence of any sort is not only logical but necessary. The indictments and arrests and executions and even assassinations are necessary if it is a life or death situation, particularly if our country and the lives of its people are in the balance. QAnon, like the New World Order conspiracy theory and the protocols of the elders of Zion before it, is a lie that gives its believers license to indulge in their worst and most fascistic impulses. It makes them heroes in a struggle. It makes them saviors of their own reality. Okay, so I think, again, I wanted to fit this segment of my interview with Jared in here because I think the spread of this conspiracy theory, how it bled its way into the Republican Party, it bled its way into even the mainstream political discourse. I mean, the effects of this spread of this thing has been profound. I mean, this eventually culminated, I think, in what happened on January 6th. I think I had posted something on social media regarding how kind of difficult it is to navigate conversations, political discussions right now. And it's always been difficult. There's always that thing where like, oh, you go to Thanksgiving with your family and you got to deal with the racist uncle or the, ignorant family member that mentioned something and you have to deal with that. But it's gone to a real point now with all these crises we're in the midst of currently where it is a real thing. It's very concerning to many people. So I had a friend who I've known for a little while, but I think she saw something I had posted about this and she's like, hey, I just want to have a conversation. So we were on the phone talking and she's like, hey, I have this best friend, someone she loves dearly, who was getting sucked into the QAnon conspiracy theory, right? And while certainly it's being discussed now more and more, I mean, it's gotten to a point where what I used to think of as fringe theories that were on the edges of political discourse, they weren't really within what we'd call the Overton window of political discourse in this country. Now it is, and it has to be talked about. So anyway, my friend was just very concerned. She's like, I love my friend, but she's just buying into this theory that's just so weird. It's fucking weird. But
it's really weird.
It's really weird because when you really look at it, it's very strange. But like, and she just wanted to get my thoughts on it, and I actually sent her because again, when I first became familiar with you, was a Twitter thread that you had published on the dangers of these conspiracy theories. You went into the history of it. I think you pointed to like all the way back to maybe 19th century, early 20th century with the spread of some of these very anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that were...
It goes all the way back to medieval ages.
Right.
I mean, it really... mean, like there's stuff going on right now, like blood libel, that goes back to like, we're talking kings and queens as nations are coming about. So no, you're exactly right. Like this has a long history. And of course, we got here is a completely different story. But yeah, this is a long line of this stuff.
Yeah. And so I shared with her some resources and just tried to say, hey, because I think for her, one of the defining feelings she was expressing to me was that reality itself was like, am I crazy for thinking that they're crazy? Is there something to it? What's going on? And she just wanted to kind of be reassured that she's not crazy, that she does have a grasp on reality. And I'm like, yeah, this is a very difficult time for that very reason. But anyway, I mean, I wanted to just point to that and ask you, because I think that was something I really wanted to focus on, at least at the very beginning of this, which is if you could explain this theory. I mean, just give us the basic, understanding of what it is, maybe where it came from. And if you could just give us some background on that.
Yeah. Do you mind if I go on like just a quick tangent? Because what you just said, I felt like was very powerful. This idea that reality as we know it is sort of coming apart.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which I actually think is one of the biggest topics and one of the most important topics that we as a people have no interest in actually talking about. Right. Like it's weird to talk about. Like it's a weird esoteric kind of an idea. But I think in order to understand the conspiracy theory stuff, you have to understand that. And so I think one thing that Americans are starting to really come around on, and it's a rude awakening. I mean, like I was telling somebody the other day, I was like, this year's 4th of July had to be the most bizarre 4th of July for everyone. We're in a country that you get to like this patriotic day that's supposed to celebrate American exceptionalism, right?
Yeah.
And then you get there and we're in the midst of a pandemic that is so bad that people are dying left and right, and you can't go out and you can't have your fireworks, you can't have your cookouts, you can't have your gatherings. So it's really weird to be celebrating this idea of American exceptionalism while America is failing. Right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we have to understand before we understand conspiracy theories is we have to understand that that idea of American exceptionalism that I think people like you and me and maybe people listening to this podcast grew up with is that that reality was never actually real. That reality was a mythology. It was a story that we were told. And by the way, everyone's told it. This is what's taught in schools, right? There's this idea of America that goes from point A to point B, and it's supposed to be this mythology where America is like the arbiter of all that is good and just and freedom and liberty and equality. Well, guess what? That's not a reality that everyone has always experienced, because people of color and LGBTQ Americans and women and you name it, they have not experienced that. Right. Mm-hmm. They've heard about it, and their own experience did not bear out on that. Well, as social media is coming around, and as politics has to become more and more inclusive, and culture has to be more inclusive, we're starting to hear from people who have never experienced that. And I think we're all starting to realize, holy hell, that wasn't all true. Right. And so it's like this weird thing. And I try and tell people, it's like, I grew up in what I now call the cult of the shining city, which is a neo-Confederate, apocalyptic, white identity evangelicalism. Or if you just want to call it modern white Christianity, you can do that. Right. Which is the idea that America is God's chosen country, which means that we are his champions of good and the inheritors of the universe's will. Right? Mm-hmm. We are fighting for what's good, and anyone who opposes us is evil and needs to be taken down. And you know, that's the mythology of America that many Americans have grown up with. Well, so let's go into the mindset of that. If you truly believe that America is God's chosen country, right? And that there's an omnipotent, all-powerful being who is watching over this country and taking care of it. Well, why would we ever fail? Right? Yeah. How does a country that is God's chosen country ever fail? And if you listen to regular American history, or you've learned history through the schools, that's the America that we're talking about. So how did it fail? Well, the conspiracy theories all play upon that idea of unique nationalism. Right. I'll just go ahead and I'll start in 1930s Germany, because actually one of the things we don't like to talk about is that America and Nazi Germany were really linked. Mm-hmm. Like we have really strong ties with each other. And we actually inspired a great deal of the Third Reich. Well, there's this myth in Germany called the knife in the back. And the knife in the back is a conspiracy theory that the reason why the German army lost in World War I is because they were betrayed from the inside by the Jewish people. There's no way that Germany could have lost World War I, because they were the best army and they were the chosen country and they were the strongest. So all of a sudden, if that is what you believe, you have to start looking for explanations, right? Like, what is it that could possibly hold us back? Well, the knife in the back is always this part of unique nationalism. And in America right now, we're in the middle of a massive existential crisis. Because so I'm 38 years old. I graduated from graduate school in 2008, just as the housing market was falling apart, right? I had spent years protesting the Iraq War. We were becoming less and less respected in the global arena. By the way, now I'm looking at a possible Great Depression. The country is on fire with the pandemic. And I come from Indiana, from a family full of factory workers and miners. Well, what happened to those factories? What happened to those mines, right? The people in my family grew up with those jobs, and they suddenly went away. Well, where did they go, right? So the reason why we have the conspiracy theories is because you have to support the myth of the unique nationalism, right? America is God's chosen country. Well, why are we suffering right now? Why are we faltering? We have to find a knife in the back, right? It's not our fault. It's not God's fault. There has to be something wicked and evil that is pulling us back and keeping us from greatness. Well, so the people that we're talking about, and unfortunately, I have a lot of people that I care about who are currently getting lost in this. They're sharing QAnon stuff. They're sharing white supremacist stuff. I mean, they're being worked over by this stuff. They do not have the language to understand yet why this stuff has happened. So we could sit here and we could probably talk for an hour about NAFTA. We could talk about global economics. We could talk about deindustrialization in America and why the factories went away, why we're moving away from coal and mines, and why, like, my hometown was devastated by a multinational corporation like Walmart. We could talk about Reaganomics, but we would talk about that because we had knowledge of those things. Right? Because we had an understanding of history and how politics actually work. Well, guess what? A group of people that doesn't have knowledge of how politics works, they have to create folklore. They have to create urban legends to explain how these things happen. And unfortunately, when you look at something like, so in the 1990s into the 2000s, it was the New World Order, right? If that rings a bell for people. New World Order is just a simplified explanation of the, globalism. And instead of, oh, these people are after your money, all of a sudden it's like Satan. Satan's after you, and he's trying to kill you and your family, right? The deep state is just the New World Order with a new coat of paint, right? And QAnon is an interactive, supernatural New World Order, right? You can go online and you can find the clues. And then as a result, and this is one of the reasons why QAnon is so dangerous, because the New World Order and the deep state, we can't take it down. These are like big, giant conspiracies, and we can't take them down. In QAnon, you can. If you find the right clue, it's like what is it? It's like an artificial reality game. If I find the right clue, I could take down the deep state. I could be the savior of humanity if I just watch the right YouTube video or I discern the right code. So it gives people who are powerless the sensation of having power, which is part of a cult. All of these things run on cult logic, and all of them change the exact same way as a cult logic. So we can talk about like how to get through to people who are going through this, but we have to understand that conspiracy theories are the language of cults, particularly in terms of powerlessness.
So I really appreciated that interview with Jared because he really very, very clearly, through that hour or so that we spoke, articulated not only the tenets of QAnon, which I didn't include in that segment because he does actually explain what people who adhere to this belief system, what they actually believe. Since doing that interview with Jared, there has been a plethora of mainstream coverage of the QAnon phenomena. And I think at this point, many people understand the basic tenets of it, like the belief that there is some individual or group of individuals in the intelligence community in the United States who are dropping cryptic messages, or at least were dropping cryptic messages, Q drops as they were called, and that out of these messages, it was basically pointing to this event that was going to occur in which a cabal of pedophiles, cannibals, and so on that run the government of the United States and probably the world, like the New World Order, as Jared discussed there. These group of people were going to be rounded up and arrested and put on trial, and it was going to be a whole thing, and we were going to save the country and save the world, and it was this like messianic kind of thing, or this end of days, the millennium is coming, that kind of vibe, that kind of structure, framework of understanding. And Donald Trump somehow in that is the savior. He is the one that is facilitating this storm that was going to happen, this great awakening that was occurring. We all saw what happened. We know that Donald Trump lost the election. We know that the election wasn't stolen from him, of course. This is why the QAnon thing is so important to talk about, because even if the prophecies, the so-called prophecies of the QAnon cult didn't come about, there is still this thing, because of how cults work, this thing where some of its most persistent, strongest adherents have reformulated their ideas and adapted to the changing circumstances. So the fact that Trump is not president does not actually change the fact that people believe very, very strongly in this worldview. That's how culting works. You have a cult leader say that, okay, on this date, at this time, the world's going to end. We get to that date, we get to that time, nothing fucking happens. Well, some of the most devoted followers believe in it even more strongly. They want to reshape reality to fit the narrative that made sense to them up to that point. And I think, again, I want to really point to the pandemic, because that's what this whole segment of this episode is about, is the pandemic really created the perfect breeding ground for this type of conspiracy theory, this sort of culting dynamic to emerge, and not just emerge because it had already emerged years prior to this, but to really grow, to fester, to expand, to deepen into mainstream political discourse, into the political establishment itself. And we saw a dramatic event occur on January 6th where this sense of entitlement and this idea of tyranny being brought down upon us and so on because of the pandemic, because of public officials' reaction to it. This created the pretext for this type of QAnon conspiracy theory to grow and become, again, a very pervasive thought form in the public. And so during this period of time when I was recording this interview with Jared, I also interviewed the co-host of the Conspirituality podcast. And that podcast is hosted by Derek Beres, Matthew Remski, and Julian Walker. So I was able to get all three of them on to discuss their work. And to read from my description here, in continuing my exploration into QAnon and the widespread proliferation of and cult-like adherence to conspiracy theory thinking in the United States, I felt it was time to have this discussion with the host of this timely, well-crafted, and increasingly needed podcast project. Conspirituality uncovers the intricate dynamics at play in the merging of the health and wellness community, or the alt-health community, and its online influencers with this far-right conspiracy theory, including the cult dynamics at play in its popularity and spread, the role social media plays in disseminating these ideas, and what the popularity of these ideas mean for political action and discourse in our time of rising authoritarianism and right-wing populism. And to quote from their website, as the alt-right and New Age horseshoe toward each other in a blur of disinformation, well-intentioned discourse and honest debate are being smothered. Charismatic influencers exploit their followers by peddling dangerous conspiracy theories. In the process, spiritual beliefs that nurture creativity and meaning are transformed into memes of a quickly globalizing paranoia. Conspirituality attempts to bring clarity to this conversation. A journalist, cult researcher, and philosophical skeptic discuss the stories, cognitive dissonances, and cultic dynamics tearing through the yoga, wellness, and New Age spirituality worlds. Yeah, I think what was most disturbing, and I think this is something that I think about, is that people, and this ties into, I think, the appeal of conspiracy thinking, conspiracy theories, is that you can often, I think it comes from a sense of helplessness and a sense of like, if there is this cabal or this elite group of people that are in control of everything and are enslaving the human population, then it kind of speaks and gives validation to that feeling of helplessness that we all feel living within a alienating capitalist society. And I would also say that when it comes to, I think, the appeal of QAnon specifically, is that this relates to an interview I did recently with the Jared Yates Sexton. We talked about QAnon and why it's so pervasive, is that it actually gamifies the whole conspiracy theory thing, where everybody's participating in decoding, trying to decipher these riddles, these Q drops. So everybody feels like they're on the edge of like solving something, some big, great awakening is about to happen. The storm is about to happen. All of these pedophiles and child cannibal eater people are going to be like rounded up in some mass arrest thing, and Trump is somehow involved in this. And I think, that to me, what was so fascinating about it is that it has these elements of conspiracy theory, but it's so much more engaging. And I think social media plays a big part in that.
For sure.
So I don't know. I guess not really a good question in there, but what your thoughts are on like, why is it that QAnon specifically as this conspiracy theory? Because in that interview with Jared, we talked more about the alignment of evangelical Christian communities and QAnon. They go together pretty well. They meld together pretty well. But what you two, or all three of you, I should say, are addressing more is the alignment of the health and wellness influencers and community and QAnon. And I find this really fascinating. What do you think? I know we kind of touched on it a bit there, but what do you think are those intersections there? Why is it that seemingly progressive-minded people who care about health and wellness and all this stuff are getting sucked in by a far-right conspiracy theory? I don't know who wants to go first. I can maybe throw that to Derek first.
I'll jump in because I'm going to take something Julian said and run with it for a moment, and then I'll pass it to him. When he mentioned the lack of critical thinking, I think a lot because, we've done an episode on vaccines, for example, and it is a very polarizing issue. But what people don't understand is that just because we think that vaccine works because all the science generally says vaccines are one of the most effective ways of protecting you against viruses and diseases. And yes, there is some possible problems with it, and that is documented online and very honest about it. But people will then assume that we are shilling for big pharma. And my other world is in psychedelic therapy, where the entire book I'm writing about is basically showing how psychiatry has pharmacologized mental health to a point where it's very harmful to a lot of people. These are all nuanced subjects, and they are not black and white, any of them. But wellness influencers generally take a contrarian position because of many of the real problems that the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry have created in a capitalist system. That we've gone from this $1 trillion pharmaceutical industry to this $40 billion. That number is, kind of varies, but wellness and supplement industry. So you look at these things and you're like, okay, just because I probably shouldn't be taking a statin for my cholesterol, that does not necessarily mean this herb that you found in some exotic country, just because somebody said it works, is going to, but that's what happens. So you see this constant contrarian position that wellness influencers take, that think that anything that comes from a respected source or something that's funded by someone they don't like, therefore cannot work. And that's simply not true. But I think that mindset of always being anti whatever the popular or the mainstream thing is presented to you by doctors is the wrong thing, set them up perfectly for this sort of indoctrination into QAnon, because it very much feeds that contrarian position that they hold already.
Yeah, it's the term that I coined, freshman skepticism, right? That there's a kind of entryway into skeptical thinking where there's this intense mistrust of the mainstream media and big pharma and public health officials, but there is not the same kind of scrutiny applied whatsoever to the alternative claims that are being made, or to the alternative figures that are stepping forward to monetize those kinds of claims. But I wanted to come back to something that Matthew said about the gig economy, and the sense of, I feel like there's a sense of, and you were saying it too, Patrick, of the alienation. There's a level of anxiety that I think is pervasive in terms of the uncertainty of our lives and trying to get ahead. And do you have health insurance? And what's going to happen with all these different variables that I think sets us up because the tone of conspiracy theories is essentially paranoid. And so that paranoia, I think, plugs into anxiety quite well. If there's a free-floating anxiety you have that you're not quite sure how to identify, because you're supposed to be too blessed to be stressed, and you're supposed to just believe in yourself and know that you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and become, whoever you want to in this great free society. If you're not oppressed, if there's nothing, that if you don't have an analysis of the political or social situation that helps you make sense of that anxiety, then a paranoid conspiracy theory fits the bill. And I also think this whole idea of gamification and getting caught up in something that's fascinating. It reminds me of being a teenager. I don't know if this was the case in the United States, but certainly in South Africa, I remember first coming across Nostradamus. Right. Mm-hmm. And Q is kind of a Nostradamus-esque figure, right? Here are all of these cryptic things for you to decode and try and understand, and what do they mean and how do they correlate? And it's very similar to all kinds of prophecy and things like astrology, where you're trying to interpret various signs and symbols in terms of how they line up with your life experience. And it takes it to a level of abstraction where you don't actually have to deal with a less sexy analysis, a more nuanced, complex, well-informed analysis of the world around you. And the last thing I'll say, just to throw it to Matthew, is, I've expressed many times, Patrick, the same question that you did: is how does this group of wellness and yoga type folks who we think of as being progressive get swept up in this far right conspiracy narrative? But I know Matthew has a contrarian point of view on whether or not we actually have been progressive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think the evidence bears it out. I think we like to think of ourselves, probably the three of us have belonged to various yoga and wellness communities that have really liked to think of themselves as being progressive. But when the shit hits the fan, either people don't want to politically organize or they want to choose very sort of uncontroversial topics like, whatever Greenpeace is campaigning on that season. To back. Yeah, I don't think that in the modern era, contemporary new religious movements, yoga, Buddhist spiritualities, that they're predictors of progressive politics. That just hasn't borne out in terms of the evidence. And the two things that come to mind when I listen to your question, Patrick, which I think is really it's a core question. So how does the wellness industry get wrapped up in alt-right conspiracy theories? First of all, to add to the political economic analysis, the prime movers for all of this stuff are in the U.S. I have to say. I mean, I might be missing something, but it does seem that conspirituality and QAnon are export products from the U.S. at this point. The only things that can travel actually outside of the U.S. Don't
remind me, Matthew.
Yeah, what's really important about that is that the wellness industries have emerged in the context of the absence of universalized healthcare. And so there is a natural structural antipathy that resists the notion that public health options or organized healthcare or all of these instruments and social mechanisms that have been so oppressive to the American public, there's a resistance to the notion that they could do any good at all. When people spend a generation being screwed over by their insurance companies and battling with doctors over diminishing levels of care, I think it's very easy for the population generally to become cynical about the value of healthcare and public health in general. And then if you actually make your business into monetizing a resistance to that or options against it, then you become even more enthusiastic in that way into libertarian healthism. So that's one thing that I wanted to add. I think these ideas and these movements do occur in Canada, and of course they occur in Europe as well, but they occur more slowly. They build more slowly. They have less sort of a viral quality. It's not like the places that have strong socialist democracies are like a tinderbox waiting to blow up with this stuff. So that's the one thing that I wanted to say. The other thing about what makes wellness people vulnerable to alt-right conspiracy theories. One thing that we haven't discussed on the podcast, but I want to flesh out a little bit more, is that at least with the spiritual communities that I know and that I know a bunch of us are familiar with, there is an ongoing and very commonplace trope around the notion of awakening. I mean, there's that word again, but awakening to reality, piercing through illusion, understanding that everything that you knew before is not as it was, piercing the veil, coming through the other side. And I would just like to see some analysis or some data around how many people matriculated in Buddhist or yoga groups where there was the notion that at a certain point in spiritual practice that you'd have this threshold realization by which you would understand that the entire world was illusory. And if that was really important to you, if that was something that you tried for, that you meditated on, that you practiced towards, we have the same kind of yearning for a complete reversal of reality that is the point. It's the pleasure principle within QAnon. When they say take the red pill, they're saying they're offering sex to people. They're offering orgasm. They're saying realize the truth, and it's a sensual I don't think it's a mistake that it is associated with a kind of euphoric high that would be connected with drug taking. They're talking about something that turns your life upside down and inside out. And I was in 2 different high demand groups in which that was the goal. It was the goal for that to happen, for you to have a moment, a series of moments, a continuing building series of moments in which everything that you understood about your life and reality was actually false. And that realizing that falsity, realizing that objects weren't objects and subjects weren't subjects, or, there was no such thing as fear, or your brain doesn't put reality together the way neurologists say it does. Having that moment was actually the goal, like the epiphany. And so with all of these people who are expressing the pleasure of a kind of transformative experience, I really wonder how much they've been prepped by a language of transcendence and immediate transcendence in modern spiritualities.
I think what was most infuriating seeing all of this play out over the past year and a half was this idea again that we were not seeing collectively, we were not all seeing the same reality, where, as Matthew, Derek, and Julian discussed in there, this thing that was happening, why we have seen this pervasive spread of conspiracy theory, we can all understand this. We can analyze why this is happening. But what was really difficult for me to deal with was knowing nurses, knowing healthcare workers that were on the front lines of this thing, that were seeing it right in front of them. They were dealing with patients that were suffering tremendously from getting this virus. It was really a disturbing thing to, again, watch people just outrightly say that this is all a big hoax and that this is all being overblown and that it's just like the flu, and see grifters spread a bunch of misinformation wantonly just so they can build up their brands. I mean, it was like the perverse quality of contemporary capitalism mixed in with these cultic dynamics of the QAnon conspiracy theory, mixed in with the sorrow, the dread, the grief that comes from so many people getting this illness, having long-term health issues because of it if they survive it, or dying from it. It was a lot to take in. There was so much to try to comprehend when all of this was happening last year. And I keep on using the past tense. I want to be clear that this is still playing out around the world today, of course, and I apologize for doing that. I guess I'm saying the past tense only in the sense of much of this work that I'm featuring was recorded last year, right? Now, before the vaccines began to roll out in the United States, just over the past several months this year, there were places all over the country that began to see spikes in cases. We still are seeing spikes of cases, but I think the impact that it's having on the healthcare system has diminished, thankfully. And so I mentioned the frontline workers. Now, I released a series of 3 interviews in December of 2020 because in the county that I live in southern Idaho, we had a real influx of cases, and there was a real fear that hospitals in this county and in this state would be completely overwhelmed. And there were points where that happened or almost happened. And this happened in many other states as well. This happened in other parts of the country where they were completely overwhelmed with COVID patients. I interviewed 3 nurses, and those nurses were Jennifer Gardner, Sammy Ruggles, and Amy Liu. And there's one interview in particular I just want to highlight because I think, again, we're all at the point now where just like we all understand what QAnon is at this point, I hope we all understand what it is. We also understand the nature of the virus and how it works and what it does to the body and so on. But I really just wanted to highlight this interview with Amy Liu because she worked, at the time of this interview, worked directly with COVID patients in the local hospital. And she may still be doing that now, I don't know. But at the time of the recording of this interview, that's what she was doing. It was an emotional interview because I gave Amy the space to just express what it's like to be on the front lines of this thing, to see this thing in person, to witness people go through the fear, the just difficulties of having this virus. And so what I wrote here was that Amy has been attending to patients suffering from COVID-19 for several months, and she describes the impacts this pandemic is having on healthcare workers' ability to provide an adequate level of care as infection rates in Idaho continue to spike, with insights into the heavy emotional and psychological toll imposed isolation has on patients and their loved ones as they battle the dire symptoms of the virus. And that's the point in playing this interview for you, because what was, again, so absolutely frustrating was seeing this fragmentation of our collective sense of reality, where members of our communities who are working as nurses, as healthcare workers, were witnessing something tragic happening, and there were so many people who just didn't give a fuck, who just were so disconnected from that, whether we're talking about the alt health influencer types, or we're talking about the QAnon political operatives, or we're talking about regular people. There was just this thing that was happening psychologically that was really disturbing to watch. How people could just dismiss something that was happening right in front of them. That was what was really enlightening, if I could use that word, or really woke me up to just how deep ideologies penetrate into people's lives, how people are literally dying in hospitals and people just don't want to believe. It's inconvenient for them. It really speaks to privilege. It really speaks to the entitlement of the U.S. population in a general sense. It really speaks to these decades of propaganda and misinformation have really built up to this moment where, when we really needed to have a public health response that was adequate, when we really needed to have a population that was on board with that, we failed. Yeah, I just want to, I guess, ask, like, how are you doing? I mean, how are your fellow nurses and doctors, maybe on a more personal level? I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but just like...
Well, I'll talk about all of it. You know, I'm an open book for this subject.
Okay.
I think one word I can use to describe is I'm just mad.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mad at that how long it's taken, that people are still not paying attention. There's still fear in me. Like, you know, we as healthcare workers, we're under the microscope in health too.
Yeah.
You know, I have several family members are for masks, several who are against, and that puts me in a very difficult position too. I mean, they're going to believe what they want. There's no way I'm going to change that, but that's not going to stop me from promoting it.
Sure.
Promoting, you know, self-isolation, and it's hard because I'm such a social person too, and thank goodness I get to go to work every day, and I get to be in that camaraderie of people who know what we're going through. I have several burnout buddies that you know, we're able to talk about, people who, you know, you talk to some people and they're like, oh, you're great, you're amazing, I can't believe what you do. But it's not that. It was rough. We barely got through the day. You know, it's some of us are kind of disgusted with the term healthcare heroes because it doesn't feel that way. We don't always feel like, I mean, we did the best that we could some days, but at the end of the day, I know that it wasn't the job that I could have done prior. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I did my best, but was it my best? Because of the weight that we have on us there.
Yeah.
And with patients being in isolation and not being able to have that family advocate there with them every day, that's a lot more on our backs that we have to advocate for this patient. We're in their room, we're passing meds, you know, and a lot of times it's really hard to build that rapport, that relationship with your patient when you're so stretched.
Yeah.
So we try to make our time the best as possible, but you know, it's definitely hard.
Yeah. I imagine there's that sense of camaraderie among your fellow workers, right? I mean, you're kind of in the trenches, so to speak, in this thing.
Right. There's, you know, we're all sick of it, but it's what it is and it's what we're doing. And at the beginning, you know, it's like, oh, we went to school, like we're nurses and we're going to save people and we're doctors and we're we're here in the ICU, and as soon as, we hear about what's happening, it's like watching a big wave come from the East Coast here, just crashing down, like the wave of COVID. That's how I could explain it. So we do our research. We try to figure out, let's learn more about droplet precautions, more about virology. And here, as we're studying for this stuff, our thirst gets quenched from a fire hose of information. Just so much is just beating on us. Every day it's a new thing, every day a new policy. So it's overwhelming on some days, and but we still go.
Yeah.
We're still there.
Well, the thing that comes up for me is there anything, I mean, this has been going on for months now, probably since March, I would say. In this time, I mean, I'm sure you've had a lot of time to think about it and begin to process what's happening, but is there anything that was really surprising or extremely revealing to you about this? Things that maybe had come to you and you're like maybe in regards to like how the state or the government, the federal government or any of these other institutions have responded to this, or how the public has responded. Has there been anything about this that has like surprised you or has been really like revealing to you?
I'd say that the support from our community at the beginning of all this was amazing. And we weren't really even in the heat of it at that point. Like it had just started, and then we all got on lockdown, fizzled out for a little bit. And then I saw a good example of, at the beginning, the amount of COVID and then the fear of COVID. And now it's the fear of COVID and COVID, right?
Right.
So people
it's reversed. Yeah.
So the supportive community, I would say, shocked me that it's no longer there as much as I feel like it was before. People were taking it serious and now they're not. And it's not that I don't want people to live in fear of it. I just want them to be respectful of everybody. This is our community. This is all we have. If, our locals are dying off, our businesses aren't going to stay, around and support. I don't know. That's one thing. Definitely another shocking thing during all of this is actually seeing how our administration at the hospital deals with this. It would not be an easy job. I'm glad that I get to be a bedside nurse during all of this. My mom's also a nurse, and she manages a clinical office, and she says, I can't do what you do. Well, I couldn't imagine managing, 50 plus people who are in fear of coming to work every day and trying to help fill their bucket so they could come. And also the government's response to it. I mean, it's to the point, honestly, that I unfortunately have stuck my head in a hole to most of the public media because it's too much, and I have to focus on myself and my patients and know how to treat them from what I know, because it's all negative out there. I can't even be on social media because of the animosity. It's overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned you had family that's for masks and then those are against masks. And I mean, do you have conversations with those that are against wearing masks? And if so, what would you say to them, or what have you said to them about that?
I have. It's a lot of it's the, well, you can't tell me what to do kind of attitude.
Yeah.
And so I've brought up, well, they also sorry, I'm just collecting my thoughts here.
You're good.
So it's the no gun, pro gun. So you want to keep your gun to protect your family, but you won't wear a mask to protect your family.
Right.
Like that's kind of that's a right too. It's a right to not to wear the mask, be told what to do, but it's also our right to keep our community safe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just trying to make those connections of how, I think what's so challenging about this pandemic, about viruses in general, is that one, we can't see them, right? Obviously, we can see the impacts and effects of it, but it's often seems like a very abstract threat, and so it's hard to take seriously sometimes. But but also just making that connection of like your individual actions or inaction has real potentially detrimental effects on those close to you.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I think, I mean, I'm just going to say particularly Americans, US Americans tend to have a hard time with. And I know this is another problem in other countries as well. I don't want to just isolate it on people in this country, but that just something that I've observed. It's just this sort of obsession with individual rights and not really thinking
it's
about
America. You can't take away my right.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like actually part of what I think of as actual freedom, or protecting your freedoms, is based in responsibility, and having responsibility for other people's well-being and health by just following really basic scientific guidelines, medical guidelines.
Right. It's why we have speed limits.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's why, I don't know, if one thing, COVID's been a humbling wake-up call as an ICU nurse. It gives me more time. It has taught me to give myself more time to reflect on what matters. And and it's unfortunate for those families who had to go through that, who've had to actually go through death of family members to realize that. And I hope that, I don't know, you can't always learn from other people's mistakes, but I hope that, our United States in general will kind of swallow their pride a little bit and wear a mask.
Yeah, and it seems very contradictory, but like we're not gonna get past this. I mean, I feel the isolation. Like I do very few things where I put myself in public places and where I'm around other people that are not my little bubble, I guess. But I'm tired of this. I'm tired of it. But I mean, the reality is we're not gonna get past this phase where we have to do all this stuff unless we all kind of agree to do it, and then we get through that part, and then we can begin, having some sense of like physical connection again, where we can be in each other's spaces again. So it's actually by resisting it that we're actually prolonging it, and it's just it seems contradictory, but that's just the way it is, Yeah, and so I don't know. I really just appreciate you for what you're doing. I feel like the work of nurses and doctors and just the healthcare workers in general I'm seeing more and more media cover it, which is good. But I do feel like the work you're doing has been unfortunately kind of invisibilized to a great degree. And I think we're seeing more and more people recognize like how bad that really is, how not listening to your people that are in your community that understand this really, really well and are experiencing it firsthand. We have to trust that you're telling the truth because you're seeing it and you're experiencing it daily.
Right.
It's just
people get so fixated on numbers. Oh, well, only one in blah, blah, blah. Only this many people get sick.
Yeah.
But they don't think about, okay, well, what if that one was yours? What if that one was your, and then that's it. Then you just don't get to see him again. Yeah.
And I think it's also, people have a hard time because they look at it like less than 1% of people who get COVID die, or I don't know what the statistic is now, but people don't.
That's still a large number.
It is. Yeah. Like, I mean, right now, what is it? Over 250,000 people have died in the U.S. with, less than a year of having this. So it's way more than the flu.
It may not be they die from COVID. It may not be, they may have had it and that was just the cherry on the cake, that's just the
thing that pushed it over. Yeah.
All my analogies there.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, and I'll just I think it's tied to this. It's like people have a hard time looking at it systemically. Like if you have a certain number of people that are going into the hospitals all at once, it just sort of debilitates and makes the system work a lot less efficiently, and it debilitates.
It clogs the system.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So yeah, maybe it is less than 1% of the population that has really severe cases of it. But that's not the point. It's what our hospital systems are capable of dealing with.
These patients are very it's hard. You have to don and doff your PPE going into each room. You have to make sure that you have everything that you need when you go in. And it's not like if the call light goes off, we can just walk right in and get to them and step out real quick and go to the other call light. It's, you have to be safe practice of getting in and getting out, and they're lonely, and so you don't want to be in there only for 5 minutes. We're all they really have in there as far as human interaction. And once in our hospital, once they get to a certain level, up on the cardio floor, the nurses come in once a day. They give meds, and everything else is over telemedicine. So not even people coming in to help. So I can't imagine what that would be like.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be kind of the theme of our discussion here, is just the kind of loneliness of it. It seems like,
right.
And
the depression that comes with it. And I mean, I'm sure PTSD is
sure
for everybody, for the patients, absolutely. But, we'll definitely end up with some PTSD from this too.
That was those 3 interviews. I know I just played the one with Amy, but the 3 interviews I did with those nurses were all very significant for me. Often what I do with this podcast is I talk to people from wherever they're living all over the world. Often there's an abstraction of the issues that I'm discussing just by the very nature of geographically disparate. And so when we talk about COVID, there's a very meta perspective that I can apply to it. But to actually talk with nurses in my community, in the county that I live in, expressing what it's like to be on the front lines of this thing, and with Amy especially being a bedside nurse at the local hospital, that was an emotional interview, and I really am grateful for each of those women's willingness to discuss what they were going through. And with Amy in particular, with the segments I played of our interview, I mean, the brunt of this thing was really on the so-called essential workers and the healthcare workers during this time. And it just shows how ill-equipped hospitals and the healthcare system of the United States was to deal with this health crisis, and how much stress that put on the healthcare workers, how the irresponsibility of members of the community really impacted them as well and continues to impact them up to the present. And I know, again, I've harped so much on this about just how frustrating and how angry I've personally been, and so many others have been, with the irresponsibility, the selfishness, the individualism that we witnessed in people during this time. It really highlighted some of those tendencies, those cultural tendencies, as Ali talked about earlier, of people that are a part of this culture, if you even want to call it a culture. I would also just like to maybe balance that out just a little bit, because I think that there's another element to this pandemic that was really beautiful or positive, which is the element of mutual aid. I actually think that that is the baseline of humanity. I think that's what we do naturally. I think that is what we almost always do, not just under extraordinary circumstances of crisis and collapse and calamity and so on, but just in everyday life, like when we're just living our lives, people generally want to take care of each other. And I think actually in order for that to not happen is through indoctrination, conditioning. People have to become so ethically and morally compromised and psychologically and spiritually compromised in order for that not to occur, for that to not happen. And there's a lot of reasons for that. While all of this horrible stuff was happening and we were seeing mass death occurring regularly and still occurring regularly, we had mutual aid, where the state failed to provide adequate services for people that were struggling economically in the face of this, mass joblessness that was occurring and had been occurring up to the present with this crisis and all the other things that came out of this. Mutual aid networks were doing what they do, which is provide services for communities across the country. And the next person that I would like to feature discusses this subject really, really well, and that person is Shane Burley. Shane is an author, journalist, and political researcher, and the beginning of this discussion, which I'm going to be featuring, I asked Shane to describe what mutual aid and solidarity looks like in our time of the coronavirus pandemic, with millions of workers in the United States without jobs as a result of widespread economic disruption and lack of comprehensive government aid. And as he described in an article published at Waging Nonviolence, quote, In almost every city around the United States, mutual aid networks have started to form, ranging from projects for resource distribution to simple options like fundraising, compiling lists of resources and contacts, and creating chat threads so that people in the same area can stay in contact with one another. The speed with which these groups have arrived and the depth of care that many of them offer have started to show what options communities have when the large institutions around them fail or are unwilling to deal with the disaster. End quote. We discussed several other subjects in that fuller interview, but I'm going to just be featuring a part that discusses the mutual aid networks that emerged or were that kicked into gear, I guess, during this time. Because again, this is a fundamental part of this thing. It's not just the failures of the state, which are obvious. It's not just the failures of the economic system in dealing with all the various things that came out of this crisis. It's not just about that. It's about how communities come together. That's how people choose to take care of each other in both small and very large ways. I personally saw this with just the fact that people were willing to make hundreds and hundreds of masks because there was this real need for it. And people were just willing to use their skills that they had to sew together masks, to distribute masks, and so on. I really saw this real effort, this real intention to take care of one another during this time. And that also came out of this pandemic, is that real deep sense of love and care that people have for one another. It's come up recently in my mind that this idea of mutual aid in this time where we're having these stay-at-home orders, shelter-in-place orders, I guess is what they're called, and self-quarantining and maintaining social distance and like all of this stuff. It's interesting to think about mutual aid and how to help each other within this particular context, because I think when I think about mutual aid, I think about something really deeply innate in human beings, which is we're a social animal, and the way that we care for each other is really like being in each other. I mean, there's a lot of ways we can care for each other, obviously, but one thing that really is deep inside our psyches and our bodies and what we are as a species is to actually touch each other, to be in each other's physical space and presence. If someone is distressed, you go over and you pat them on the back and you hug them. You know, you give physical reassurances that way. It helps calm people down. It shows affection and love and all of this. And we're basically being told that the best thing we can do for each other right now is to stay the fuck away from each other. Maintain 6 feet distance or more. Don't go to public spaces. Don't go to concerts. Don't go to bars and restaurants and cafes. Stay away from each other. And that's the best thing you can do for others. Now, obviously, there's a lot that can come with that. But I think it's really challenging, because it's like, how do I help other people from where I'm at, where I can't actually go out and do things for people in a like real physical sense? And so I guess I wanted to ask you, I know that you have an article you mentioned coming out. By the time this will be released, it'll probably be published, but you have an article coming out tomorrow, I think you said, about mutual aid right now. So in the context of a global, or just in this pandemic in the United States, but in the global context of a pandemic, what does mutual aid look like? How are people organizing around that?
Yeah, so mutual aid networks are not a new thing. These have existed as both kind of political projects, but also as like just survival projects, really forever. It would be wrong to say for decades or something. It's a forever complex way that human beings support each other. But there's a lot of examples of them. So the Black Panthers call these survival pending revolution programs. So things like free health clinics or free breakfast programs, where you learn history, that kind of thing. Those are providing services that the state or the exchange economy just can't provide. Food Not Bombs, providing people with food. There's a lot of versions of these. I used to be involved with a movement called Take Back the Land, which supported people moving into empty houses. It's liberating houses that are just sitting empty from foreclosure and supporting houseless families and individuals and communities to use them, fix them up and live there. There's a lot of versions of that. that go back a long time. But the point of it is that not just to provide services. It's not just doing something a charity would do really well, or like a soup kitchen or something, but to do it in a much different way. We say solidarity, not charity. So it's a shared experience where we're doing it together to support each other because we both benefit from having that strong community bond where we're both able to succeed. Rather than the top-down charity model where one person who's has resources kind of is benevolent and gives it to the person that's in worse circumstances.
Right.
And so part of this is meeting the needs of the community, but it's also about how can we actually develop a kind of counter-state apparatus, or how can we develop a strong sense of community distribution and bonds and get to know each other and that kind of thing in a way that where we can develop something that is much more adept at creating human flourishing than the systems we have now. And lots of people are doing this all across the country right now. So I talked to about a dozen or more organizations around the country, everywhere from Ypsilanti, Michigan, to New York City, to here in Portland, that are doing a number of things. So, for example, they might set up a system where people can volunteer to help out, and folks who, for example, are immune compromised or especially can't leave their home for whatever reason can put needs, and then people can go run and get groceries for them or prescriptions or bring them things, that kind of stuff. They can share resources. There was a resource fair here in Portland before the shelter order was put into place where people could come and pick up hand sanitizer that people made according to the World Health Organization's recipes. And there's a lot of kind of systems of support to get people what they need right now. A lot of people are using a lot of technological solutions to connect with people, chat apps and social media and stuff to coordinate and see where people are at. That's especially important when we're not able to share space with each other nearly as well. And so I think this is something that didn't just come out of like radical political spaces or, a union hall or a political party. It just came from people who absolutely needed it, some of which had never done anything before, but are now getting to know their neighbors and figuring out how to get people things they need. And hopefully those are the kinds of systems of support that can, for one, continue and become a permanent state of our communities, because this isn't the only kind of crisis that people might face, but also those things can be transposed into organizing spaces when mutual aid becomes things like eviction support, when people who have not been able to go to work for 3 months can't pay their rent, or when people are not able to pay for the prescriptions, figuring out how to support that in the long term. So hopefully those bonds become a base of longer organizing work down the road.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious about this because I've been seeing, I know that that Congress and I guess the Trump administration, I don't know what stage they're at right now, but I think the Democrats and Republicans finally worked out a stimulus package it's got a lot of things in it. And I was actually watching Senator Bernie Sanders speaking about this bill, and he was really pretty fair, I would say, and really pretty nuanced. He didn't hate it. He was like, look, there's a lot of issues with it. I don't like how it's basically there's a big bailout for corporations in here. But there are things in here that are going to probably be very helpful for average working class Americans, tax-paying Americans, I guess. And so I guess what I think is interesting to, think about is like the Trump administration in general seemingly has been very inadequate, and in fact has seemingly worked to actually undermine states and other regions to really work on an adequate response to this crisis. So I guess this isn't meant to be, I don't know what the word is. I want to say pessimistic or something, but I feel like the issue is there isn't really this like widespread, broad network or coalition of people that are really stand as sort of an opposing power structure to really provide aid for people. So do you maybe feel that in this time where we have really inadequate federal response and often inadequate like local state responses as well, that mutual aid networks can actually fill in the gap, the void left by the state basically?
I mean, I think it can to some degree. This is not, at least right now, at the scale that's replacing hospital beds or creating ventilators. But there is a kernel of the ability to start doing some of that work. People are very resilient, particularly in communities that are historically marginalized, about finding ways of developing those solutions. So, for example, one of the examples that I think is really important now is to look back to Hurricane Katrina and what some people did there to fill some of that gap. So there's this guy, Scott Crow, who wrote a book called Black Flags and Windmills about creating the Common Ground Collective in New Orleans. And basically, that was an all-volunteer run health clinic, borderline hospital that just showed up and started doing the work. People coming together, getting people's prescriptions, trying to get them care, and doing that work, and really filled the gap in a really profound way. This was much more, I think, successful than a lot of mutual aid projects we think of. But there is the capacity to do those sorts of things. I think it's right that, it's not like everyone is equipped with all the tools to fill every gap, and things like the stimulus bill, I'm sure, will be helpful for folks. I think what people are looking towards right now, though, is how we can start to maintain strong communities that generates those resources over time. And it's unfortunate that work oftentimes has developed amidst a crisis. It would be, some of the most successful mutual aid networks right now have actually existed for a number of years already, doing things like clothing drives and food pantries, food distributions, needle exchange, support for sex workers, things like that. And so it would be great if those things had developed for a long time. But I think this is a step in that right direction. And the way that people are kind of confederated, people do it in their community and then hopefully can connect with other communities. But it starts at home right away, not depending on like a larger kind of nationwide apparatus, actually makes it, I think, more responsive to people. It's also more adaptive, and it can move a lot faster.
So as Shane elaborated on there in that segment, he was able to explain the ways in which mutual aid, as a fundamental characteristic of human caring, of human organizing, as a way that we as human beings operate, have been able to provide care for one another within the context of a pandemic. And there was another interview that I had done around this subject of mutual aid, and I actually released this back in early 2021, earlier this year, and that was with Duncan Tarr. And Duncan is a prison abolitionist and researcher for Perilous, a chronicle of prisoner unrest across the U.S. and Canada. And they joined me to discuss a recent report that Perilous had come out with at that time, documenting the wave of strikes, rebellions, and general acts of civil disobedience organized by detainees in prisons, jails, and ICE detention centers that have occurred since the coronavirus pandemic began. So I'll just give you a bit of insight into what this research that Perilous does and what they released in their report, what that was all about. So I'm going to quote here from that. At Perilous, a chronicle of prisoner unrest, we track all instances of prisoner protest across the United States and Canada since 2010 that involve multiple prisoners. In early 2020, we were paying close attention to the outbreak of prisoner rebellions, escapes, riots, and resistance in other parts of the world in response to the coronavirus, most notably in Italy. As COVID breached the shores of the United States where we live, we prepared ourselves as best we could to document what we anticipated would be a huge uptick in prisoner organizing and action. That wave did in fact crash, and we subsequently counted 119 instances of prisoner resistance in the first 90 days of the COVID crisis. These actions occurred in prisons, jails, detention centers, and more. We mark the date of that crash as March 17th, the date of the first two actions that we are aware of, in which the participants clearly articulated the actions as responses to the spread of COVID-19 behind bars. So this whole interview is just about going over that data, about the fact that we did see across the United States and Canada so many examples of prisoner rebellions, riots, acts of civil disobedience. This was really an unprecedented wave of prisoner action, of prisoner resistance. And it was in direct response to the pandemic, because one of the things, of course, the pandemic has highlighted is the atrocious conditions in which prisoners are subjected to. The United States has one of the, if not the largest, carceral system in the world. For supposedly being the freest country in the world, we have more people in prison in our country than practically anywhere else in the world per capita. There are millions of people in the U.S. prison system. And that is a crisis in and of itself. That reveals so much about the society in which we are a part of, about the government that we have. Especially with COVID, the conditions were so bad, the virus was spreading so fast among the populations in these prisons that prisoners really had no choice but to speak up and to make their voices heard by any means necessary. Of course, every prison was different, every act of resistance was different for each of these prisons, but nonetheless, they spoke up, they made their voices heard, and that is something that Perilous was able to document really well, at least to the best of their ability. In this very short piece I want to feature here, I asked Duncan about the ways in which people outside of prisons could show support and solidarity for those inside the prison. Duncan explains that a bit. It's a rather short piece, but it does explain another element of what mutual aid looks like, because, again, the crisis of COVID really generated so much unrest in so many different segments of our society, including in the prison population. And I'm curious about organizing outside of prisons. I mean, how involved are people like, I'm not in a prison right now. I mean, how involved can people like yourself and like myself that are outside of prisons, how involved are people like us in helping in these, mass actions in prisons? I mean, how involved are people on the outside of prisons in that process?
Yeah.
Is there a way to answer that at all? I mean, it's kind of probably widespread and very different case by case, I assume.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. I also think maybe for a starting point, we can I think one of the functions that like prisons, one of the things we imagine them to do is like separate people from society or something. And to some extent, okay, yeah, that's fine. Like there's like, geographically moved from a city to this like prison in a rural place. This is true, but also they're actually just part of society still. They're like, and I think this is more obvious now, as you actually said earlier in the interview, like these things that have always been there now more obvious. Like, the walls are porous. Guards go in and out. Guards carry the virus in and out. There's the walls like almost like serves and the razor wire like serve this ideological function that's actually to a large extent not true, and that's related to the outside support for me, because I think not only is it stuff like if the Department of Corrections messes up and spreads the virus to a facility, then the town will also get the virus. That's true, but also like people on the outside are actually participants. I think thinking of that, for me, I prefer to think of it that way. I think like prisoners and people on the outside like almost like participating together in some shared resistance kind of thing. And I mean, like even something as simple as doing something like some of the first car demonstrations, which actually have generalized since March around the country now, like the Trump supporters do them, but also they actually began as supporters of ICE detainees in New Jersey, doing the first organized car demonstrations in the United States.
Yeah.
Sort of like they were called like various things like honkathons or something, like all these kind of like silly names. And and like so in this case prisoners can actually hear and often see the protests happening outside, and ideally that that I think that goes a long way of if they know there's people outside paying attention and actually supportive of them in whatever actions they're taking, then I think then it's like not just like I think then it's like a collaborative effort basically, and it's something like collective resistance that spans across the prison walls. And I think the car caravans are amazing, and I think people like kind of activist, maybe like abolitionist kind of activisty groups are doing them all over the country still, and also just family members of there's like Facebook groups in every state of like wives of prisoners or something like this, some variation on that, and they're just organizing them, and it's actually really quite beautiful. I mean, the other day in Michigan, I think there was 3 separate ones, like not coordinated on a Saturday. Like one of them went to the private home of the Department of Corrections, and then and there's 2 other ones like outside of prisons. And as far as I know, those were not coordinated at all. It's just people taking action. And the prison it means a lot to the prisoners too. I mean, from when, Yeah.
Well, I can imagine. I imagine just the psychological toll of being in these isolated cages, basically. Um, and then to witness people on the outside, like, oh, we see you, and we know you're in there, and we know what you're going through, and then to like participate in that. I can't imagine what that's like to be in that situation to begin with, but I can only imagine just like that feeling of like solidarity and support that extends outside of the prison walls. It's got to be really important for people that have been incarcerated. I can only imagine.
Yeah.
I really wanted to include that section with Duncan just as a way to show one of the ways that the pandemic has impacted us collectively is that it has disproportionately impacted people that have been incarcerated because of the nature of what it is to be a prisoner in the United States in particular. You're at a very high risk of not only getting the virus, but of getting sick from the virus and potentially dying from it. And so when this type of thing happens, when a pandemic emerges, it really does heighten the tensions. It really does expose the various flaws in the societies in which we're a part of. So I really appreciated Duncan and the work that Perilous Chronicle has done in order to highlight the situation that prisoners have been in particular during this pandemic. To really talk more about this act of mutual aid, I wanted to jump outside of the United States. I know that I've been very US-centric in this section, talking about how the pandemic has affected the U.S. population. But I was connected with an individual, an activist in the Philippines. Their name is Ja Realidad, and Ja lives in Manila. And I recorded this in April of last year. And this was, of course, the early part of the pandemic, and the situation in the Philippines was really dire. And one of the things that was really dire about the situation wasn't as much the pandemic itself and how it was affecting the population, which of course it did and has up to this point, but the ways in which the very authoritarian government of the Philippines was imposing a national lockdown. And so Ja is an activist. He's someone that believes very strongly in the idea of communities organizing themselves outside of the control of the state, outside of capitalism. And he himself was a part of efforts to provide aid and care for people in his community. A large part of the interview is to just discuss that situation in the Philippines at that time. As Ja explains, large segments of the Filipino population, particularly in the crowded metropolitan areas of the nation, like Manila, were faced with staggering levels of involuntary hunger as the nation grappled with the outbreak of COVID-19. And very little was being done to aid the most affected, which is the working class and poor. As social distancing measures were imposed, domestic travel was severely limited, and personal protective equipment was being hoarded by the political and economic elite. And to make matters even worse, the president of the Philippines, quote, took to the airwaves with a chilling warning for his citizens: defy the lockdown orders again and the police will shoot you dead, end quote. This really speaks to, and this is what Ja talks about in here, really speaks to the authoritarian tendencies of the leaders of these various nations and how their reaction to COVID really heightened those tendencies towards authoritarian measures, allegedly to halt the spread of the virus, but actually it was a pretext to enact more severe surveillance and government control over people's lives, their movement, and so on. And there's a very big difference between trying to limit people's ability to travel to stop the spread of the virus, and then to just do that in order to maintain hegemonic control over the lives of those that these governments preside over. It's a little different, right? I mean, there's a difference between trying to limit the spread of the virus and then providing aid for people directly, which some governments have done, and then doing what the Philippines did, which is to make promises that they were going to do that and then not following through, and then making threats like, we'll shoot you if you defy our orders. So there was an article that I was referred to leading up to this interview, published at Link's International Journal of Socialist Renewal, and the title of that was Philippines, the Duterte Regime and the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Case of a Weak but Authoritarian State. What I quoted there in the description was, on March 23rd, Duterte put to Congress the erroneously titled Bayanihan Act of 2020. The word Bayanihan means community assistance or communitarian, and the spirit of Bayanihan means assistance given voluntarily and without any monetary consideration by a member of the community. The title itself is fake, a lie. Nowhere in the bill does the spirit of Bayanihan prevail. The doctors, nurses, health workers, grocery employees, transport workers, and all the frontliners who are heading the fight against COVID-19 are not empowered by this bill. Instead, it extends more power to Duterte, the bureaucracy, and his minions. The bill is sinister in many ways, as it aims to give wide powers to a president who's proven to being incompetent in dealing with the pandemic. This is what a lot of people around the world are dealing with in this pandemic. Certainly, it's a public health crisis, but it's also a crisis of the state in the sense that the state is using these crises as a pretext to enact more control over people, to expand their reach into the lives of people, and to engage in extremely corrupt acts where they're hoarding resources and not providing any of those for the people. It's really stark in places like the Philippines, where mutual aid is really the only option. In the United States, it's also the only option in many cases, but there is this sense of normalcy, quote, normalcy, that begins to come back, where we don't feel like we need mutual aid as much anymore. But in many other places in the world, this is just a way of not only surviving, but a way of thriving in the face of governments that are enacting really authoritarian measures and using these crises as a way to exact more control over people. And Ja also provides a lot of insight into how people in densely populated areas, in these metropolitan areas in particular, are suffering more than people that live in the countryside, the indigenous peoples that are still living in a more traditional fashion, that have more access to traditional forms of living and access to land and resources that people in cities just don't have. I mean, this is the tricky thing, is like, I definitely see that this virus is absolutely a public health crisis, and it needs to be taken seriously, and there needs to be social distancing, as they call it. People need to do their part to make sure that it spreads slowly, and that medical staff and people working in hospitals can deal with it as it happens in the best way possible. And so we're seeing governments enact all kinds of very strict measures to make sure that happens. But it's like under those strict measures, other things can come into play, like, authoritarianism, martial law, the expansion of the surveillance state, all of these things that are terrible and we should be resisting. But we're in a really, I'm speaking for myself, but we're in a really difficult position where, I mean, how do we resist when we're supposed to be staying, away from each other and trying to lower the spread of this virus? Is that something that you and other activists are contending with and thinking about?
Yeah, because of course resistance is something important in all
Yeah.
in all times,
Yeah.
and that's why our simple way to show how irrelevant this government is to do some direct actions based on our capacity. That's why people are they are praying to that we should get everything should be normal after 2 weeks. But I cannot say that we should ask ourselves or we should pray for it to be normalized, because that is normal. Before this COVID-19 happened, life here in Archipelago is not normal because hunger is something become natural here.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go back on that thing that they said that is natural.
Sure.
But I think we should ask ourselves that the main reason why this COVID-19 happened or this COVID-19 arrived is because of the situation, of that recent situation. And we should ask ourselves that maybe there's something wrong in the system. There's something wrong with the government. That's why how to tell people that, our way to tell people that this government is irrelevant, we do our action. We one of my collective here in Pasig City, he offer a free ride for those health workers, for those people or people who will buy food and and medicine, because just like what I said, mass transportation is not they stop the mass transportation, and yet there are some people that need to buy food, so he offered that that free ride. But I saw on my eye and I experienced that he was asked by the authority, why you're doing that. And he simply responds, "You have the car, so you can bring these people to the to the market and to the drugstore because they need medicine." And the authority said, "It is not our problem. It is not our job. Our job is to stop and to obey, what the government said." And then after that action, we also do we give some relief goods, to the coat tricycle of my friend, because some people appreciate the action. So, and a lot of people want to send him support, and he responds that, "If you will support me, maybe you can help my tricycle driver too, because we are in the same situation. Since last March 14, we don't have any income because mass transportation was on hold. So it's a good thing that these things happen. So we operate we give relief supplies these people." And then last week we launched the community hand wash. So those action overall is our way to say to community that this government is so irrelevant. Okay, it's not.
Right.
It's better not to expect anything from them, but it's better to start and practice the culture of sharing. The idea of solidarity, community care, self-determination, and of course, self-governance. So it's a simple way to show resistance, in a creative way, and through this direct actions, people. And the good thing is, we're just three working here during the first week, even for the whole year. But because of this crisis, we become 10 in the meeting, and people, my neighborhood is starting to participate on our projects. So I think that is a good result of resistance, that people starting to participate in a horizontal process, that we're doing this so we can survive, but we're doing this because we want to help our community. And we're doing this not because we want to band-aid the problem, but we want to show to our neighborhood that there's something wrong in the system, and that is not healthy. So if we want to change something, let's do that today, and we should not wait for the government to do this for us. So that's another form of resistance for us.
Okay. So the idea is that, the normal that people want to go back to was horrible. It was horrible already. And especially in this crisis, the government especially isn't doing really much or anything at all. In fact, doing things to make it worse for people, it seems. So really, it's up to us. It's up to the people to do something, to take care of each other, and to basically show that the state is irrelevant and doesn't do anything to actually help people. Is that basically what you're going for?
That is right,
That is
exactly.
right.
You
Okay.
get it right. And at the same time, we want to establish, and we want to share the idea that we should ask ourselves, what is the main roots of this, crisis or this problem. So that's why I will arrive on the idea that maybe the idea of civilization is the main roots. And I learned this words from the DGR people that I met, that civilization for me is the imperial core. That is the main source of violence. Why these things happen. So instead of looking for antidote, we should also look what are the roots of this crisis we're facing. And if people start asking themselves why this is happening, I think that's another form of resistance in an individual level.
Right. Yes, finding the source of the crisis, finding the source of the problem is a big part of this. And I think what I'm seeing is that this pandemic is revealing how really precarious this whole thing was to begin with. I mean, that to me is a big lesson that many people are taking in right now. And I think by doing what you're doing and what your comrades are doing there, you're demonstrating, look, this is what we have always been capable of doing. And we should be doing it now, just like we should have been doing it all along. And that to me is inspiring, because it's like you're taking advantage of the time that we're in and the crisis that we're in to demonstrate what's possible. And that's beautiful.
Thank you so much for the appreciation. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we have an articulation that this crisis, at some point, this crisis can be our opportunity to show to people that the system is not healthy. So at the same time, I have my articulation that that industrial civilization is not really something helpful, because as you can see, the pressure of this crisis are for those people who's living here in the city in Metro Manila. But if you will go to province, you know there are less pressure, because why? They still have land. They can still, because they have land, they can still create their own food. They have waters and natural resources. So for me, that is advanced living. And the, this is not the advanced living, seeing these buildings, dead rivers, crowded people. I cannot say that this is something civilized. So, but of
Mm,
course, that's why I'm starting to critique that this is the manifestation of industrial, civilization, and yet we called ourselves that we are civilized people because we are living in a advanced thing. We have technology here, but in reality, what's really advanced for us is those indigenous people living in the mountain, because we have there's an action coming from the north, from the mountain province. They are indigenous people. The mayor there refused to receive those goods coming from the government, and his response is, "We are sustainable here even before you can bring that. You can bring that supplies in Metro Manila because people badly needed supplies." So as you can see, even he's a mayor, but he's still trying to practice their culture, which is their practices. If you have too much supplies, then it is your obligation to help your neighborhood. So that's a good practice of indigenous people, and they can do that because they have a lot of land. They can create food, so no pressure at all. Unlike here, unlike here, the, you know we are feel very pressure here, because at the same time, you know the idea is I need to work every day so I can earn money, and if I can earn money, I can buy those supplies. So it's more about that is the situation or the setup that the system want to inject it, in people, that is more about consume and relying in a system. So that's why if we have crises like this, we become more paralyzed.
right.
So that's another thing, learning that I want to share to people, that maybe we should look, or we should create another sustainable way of life, where we don't need any government, because the government is ourself. I think that's one of the wonderful things that might happen if that things happen, and I do believe that is existing, because we have tons of different ethnic tribes here.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one, maybe that is one of our advantage, because if we will start to track those values of our ancestral, if we will start to decolonize ourselves, I think that will be helpful.
I really like the way that Ja concluded that segment I featured, discussing the ways in which civilization itself is the core problem, at least industrial civilization. This leads really nicely into the last two interviews that I would like to feature. I'll just say this, and I've said this in the previous parts to this very long episode as well, which is that this is a bit of a way for me to process a lot of the information, and actually putting this part together about COVID has been really good for me in being able to process a lot of what I've explored with others on this podcast over the past year and a half. A lot of the interviews that I featured in this section were recorded earlier on in the pandemic when I was feeling very anxious about what was going to happen. And it's interesting to see how we can kind of get used to anything. Certainly, things are shifting. Again, as I mentioned, over the past several months, things have been shifting. But it's really obvious that this pandemic, it is sending us as a collective a signal. Pandemics are a feature of civilization, particularly of a global civilization, not a bug. The next person that I would like to feature really does a great job of explaining that in the broad, deeper sense of what this pandemic really means and what it's ultimately leading to. I had the idea of featuring this person in the very first part of this very long episode discussing the ecological crisis, but I felt that it would be good to actually feature this in this section on COVID because it's talking about pandemics, it's talking about COVID, but it does also fit into the broader ecological crisis that we are in the midst of currently. And I think that ultimately this pandemic speaks to that crisis that we're in the midst of. This pandemic is a crisis situated within a larger predicament. This segment is with Joe Brewer, and Joe is a change strategist, complexity researcher, cognitive scientist, and an evangelist for the field of cultural design. Joe has a background in physics, math, philosophy, atmospheric science, complexity research, and cognitive linguistics. Joe is extremely multifaceted in his approach to so many different subjects, and I've been following Joe over the years. Since I started doing this podcast, I've regularly had interviews with him about his journey with his family, moving to South America, engaging in building regenerative cultures, and trying to regenerate the landscapes that he has moved to, that he is living in. And it's been really great to follow him and his family's journey doing this incredibly, I think, very sacred work. And so this all, again, fits within this discussion around the pandemic. So I had interviewed him back in late March of 2020. We discussed living regeneratively in the COVID-19 pandemic and the message that Gaia, that Mother Earth, is sending to us in the midst of this crisis, how we can build community resilience in the age of planetary collapse, and how there are some rather difficult truths that we need to come to in this time. Like I said, this is a message, this is a signal that we're getting from the Earth. It's like a tap on the shoulder, so to speak.
Yeah, I'd like to respond by saying two things, and one of them is a very unpleasant fact. A very unpleasant fact, so let's prepare ourselves for a potentially traumatizing idea. This system that has enabled so many people to be comfortable and to live absolutely depended upon 200 million years of photosynthesis to make all of the fossil fuels that allowed our population to get so large. And there is no solution for every human on Earth at the numbers we have now to find safety and security. That is just a fact. It's a very painful, very difficult, very morally entangled fact, but it's just a fact. And so when we talk about creating solutions that can work, we have to recognize that they can't work for everyone. And that means that the problem of equity and social justice cannot be fully addressed. Even though we should do our very best to address it, it cannot be fully addressed. And it ultimately comes back to thermodynamics and the laws of physics. And I wanted to stress saying that because it's easy for me to start describing some of the regenerative models of living that are solutions. And then people would start to say, yes, but that won't work for people living in cities, or yes, that won't work. Yes, but that won't work for 7.5 or 8 billion people. And the thing is, they are correct. And so we have to recognize that we are in a predicament. We're in a situation that has to be lived through where we manage its paradoxes, but it doesn't have solutions. And I think that's extremely important. The other thing I want to say is that the history of life on Earth, which is about 3.8 billion years old, shows us all of the lessons we need to know about how to survive, how any organism of any kind can survive. And when you take the specific lessons of human history, one thing you'll see is that, first of all, you're thinking like a geologist to do this. You're thinking on very long timescales, which our modern societies are very much not equipped to do. And one of the timescales that matters the most for what's happening right now is about a 10,000 year timescale. About 10,000 years ago, when the last ice age ended, the Earth entered a very unusual period of warm and stable climate, which is when some humans, made the transition from small-scale hunter-gatherer tribal networks to large-scale city-states, empires, civilizations, and now the global economy. And that all of this is an anomaly of history. But all of living within it on human timescales experience what is very unusual, we experience it as normal because of sampling. And I worked sampling thing on the timescales of decades for our lifespans, when this is phenomena that have arisen on timescales of millennia, of thousands of years. And this is really important because the solutions to our predicament are also on larger timescales. And they will take decades to hundreds of years, and then for some parts of it, thousands of years, to fix or heal what has been damaged in the last 200 years with industrial fossil fuel use. And you were saying earlier how difficult it is to be caught up in these rapid periods of change when you're trying to focus on deep, slow, structural issues. And one of those is that we are in a population bubble, a human biomass bubble of converting ancient sunlight into human bodies and converting intact ecosystems and biodiversity into human bodies to create the population that we have right now, and that will, quote unquote, correct itself ecologically with a population crash. And that what we're seeing now is some of the system fragilities that show how precarious this feeling of security really is. Like having food at the grocery store. I mean, there are documentaries like The End of Suburbia back in the 90s that were describing exactly what's happening now. And so this has been known by those who study it for decades. I go back to the 1970s and see the environmental writings of that time, and they were describing exactly what's happening now. So it's very important for us to have that in mind as we talk about how do we deal with this? How do we deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it feels like the living Earth is sending. It feels like a signal. It feels like this is a precursor. This doesn't feel like the end. It doesn't feel like it's, a lot of people are freaking out, I think, and having this sense that this is somehow the end of the world or something. I don't get that sense from it. I get this sense that the Earth, that with large-scale complex societies like ours, that it's inevitable that we would have pandemics, that we would have things like this. This is a check or something. This is some kind of necessary thing. And I don't mean to sound cynical, or I don't mean to sound dismissive of suffering and what's happening right now. But it does give me this feeling that this was always going to happen. It was just a matter of when. And I guess I'm going to get your sense of that. I mean, do you get this sense that Gaia is, I don't know, maybe giving us a taste of what's coming, or maybe trying to give us a little tap on the shoulder here, like, hey, this is a big deal, what's happening to the planet right now? I mean, like, what is your sense of what pandemics, and this pandemic specifically, is trying to tell us?
One thing that an increasing number of people are learning, but most people still don't know, is that the invention of agriculture actually made the quality of life worse for people. So there was this story of progress that said people lived in the jungles and their life was miserable, and as Thomas Hobbes said, it was brutish and short, and that their lives got longer and better because of agriculture and because of civilizations, and that's totally a mythology. If you study anthropology and study paleontology, you'll learn that anthropologists and paleontologists have dug up skeletons of ancient humans, and they've been able to look at things like, what's the density of their bones? How old were they when they died? Did they show signs of malnutrition? And what you find is that in hunter-gatherer societies, life was shorter than it is for a lot of them. It was shorter than it is right now, but it was actually longer in hunter-gatherer societies than for people who lived in agricultural societies. Part of the reason for this is that people in agricultural societies had a less diverse food supply, so there was more chronic malnutrition, partly because there would be changes in weather patterns, which would cause droughts, floods, and famines, which were not an issue on small scales. And there are two key differences that happened between hunter-gatherer societies and agriculture. One is the size of the populations. Hunter-gatherer societies were always small, low in number. And whereas once they started forming city-states, they started having higher numbers. And the second is spatial density, that hunter-gatherer tribes lived in distributed networks of extensive trade, where they might row their boats up a river to go and meet people from another tribe and do trade with them, but there was fairly low density of population across space. So there were relatively low numbers and relatively low density compared to agriculture. And after agriculture, city-states formed, these dense forms of social organization that were new, that we don't have evidence of the existing before. And so with the invention of dense, high population centers, one of the consequences is pandemics. Pandemics require high population density for them to spread from person to person in a viral way. So viral spread of pandemics was impossible without the invention of the city. Pandemics did not exist for humans before cities. How could they? You have a tribe of 150 people who live in a little village and they go and trade with people in another village 20 miles away. How can a pandemic spread? The transport system and the proximity is too diffuse. So pandemics are an invention. They're what you might call an evolutionary mismatch of the novel environment of living in a city, which wasn't possible until the Holocene 10,000 years ago. And that's really important. So this pandemic phenomenon is new in human history. It's only about 10,000 years old. But there's another thing is to ask, well, if human lifetimes were shorter after agriculture and the quality of life was worse, when did it eventually get better than hunter-gatherer times? And the answer is with the invention of science and the development of modern medicine, the last roughly 300 years. So it was not civilization specifically that made lives better and health better. It was medical advances with science. And medical advances with science are a specific subset of cultural evolution within civilizations. There are many civilizations that did not create science and scientifically based medicine. There were a lot of theocratic authoritarian states that religious dogma would keep medical science from developing. And so it's a specific configuration of cultural evolution within a subset of civilizations that created medical science and public health and the other related things that improved health outcomes for large populations of people. But most of that happened at the time, when we started using fossil fuels, which means it has depended upon the use of ancient sunlight. It has depended upon a rare frontier of cultural development, a frontier of discovering a non-renewable resource and rapidly depleting it in about 200 years, and depleting it while growing in impacts as a human animal to destabilize the entire planet. So this pandemic that's happening right now is a feature of cities to have pandemics, but it's a global pandemic because of the transport networks that we've built up during the last 500 years of globalization, and that really took hold with the invention of aircraft and the development of international airports. And so the population densities and the interconnectivity between cities is unprecedented in history. So of course, a global pandemic is inevitable. And anyone who studies public health from this lens, they've known this to be the case. So this pandemic is merely a feature of the high connectivity of our highly dense human population, which is a temporary phenomenon in history. So we have to hold it in that light. And then if you say, what is Gaia telling us? Gaia is telling us that we have pursued an evolutionary dead end. And the evolutionary dead end is a particular subset of cultural evolution of our species. And we have to remember that cultural evolution, like any other kind of evolution, is the use of culture technology, knowledge, values, norms, mindsets, mythologies, beliefs, all these aspects of culture, using those to create niches in which our organism, humans, is able to survive. It's an evolutionary process. And like all other evolutionary processes, it thrives on diversity and the ability to select among diverse expressions. So humans have a variety of different cultures throughout our history and present in the world right now. Some of those cultures are what might be called future fit. They have adaptive fitness to where the world is going. And other cultures that do not have adaptive fitness to where the world is going, and those cultures are self-terminating. They're pruning themselves off of the tree of life as cultural expressions. So this globalized market economy that we have right now, we have no reason to believe, we have no historical antecedents to say that this is something that we'll be able to perpetuate. It's extremely fragile, precarious to systemic risks, and absolutely dependent on fossil fuels in its current configuration. And we run out of fossil fuels even if we burn them into the point that we destabilize the climate, which would also destabilize and collapse this whole system. So this system is self-terminating. And that's the lesson. The lesson is Gaia is telling us how life forms change their environments and alter their ability to adapt to the future changes in their environments. And our lesson right now is that our globalized system is not future fit, or it's unsustainable, to use more common language. And what we need to do is go back and ask which human cultures are sustainable, and how do we know they're sustainable, and where are they in the world right now, and where we'll see the future of humanity. And that's another lesson of this, is it's telling us what's not going to work,
right?
And sense of where to look to see what will work.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you more about what those cultures look like and what they are like as you practice them. But I think I do want to just ask because I think you have a really good grasp. I mean, I think you have I think you may have stated this already, either on this in this interview or in something I read from you, but you and your wife and your family, you knew this was coming. It was inevitable that something like this would arise, as you've stated, explaining how these systems have come into being. But I want to ask, I mean, I'm situated within the United States. You're situated within the context of Colombia. These are colonial states. These are states that were built around settler colonial culture and mindset. So understandably, this is an unsustainable model. As you say, it's not future fit. But I mean, I want to get your sense of what do you expect these systems that I'm in, that you're in, that many billions of people are in currently. How do you think they're going to, or are currently, trying to, I guess, mitigate this or deal with this, and how long do you think they can keep that up? I guess I'm just asking, what is your sense of how is the system going to try to deal with this crisis as you see it right now?
I want to say something that is sort of a side point, and I want to say it first, and then I'll answer the question.
Okay.
The side point is, if you were to go outside and stick your hands down on the ground and get a handful of dirt, and then take that dirt and look at it under a microscope, you would discover that there are millions of microorganisms and probably thousands of species just in the soil that's in your hand. I want to start with that because when most of us see when we look at the world is a monoculture lens of the global economy. So you might feel like, I'm not saying you're doing this, but a person might feel like if I'm in the US, the culture, quote unquote, monolithic culture is the US culture. The reality is that there is a blend of many different cultures all in the same space at the same time, but we're mostly unaware of them. And I say that because what's going to happen requires us to understand that. We need to understand that what we're going to see is the breakdown in various expressions, the breakdown of this big, monolithic, decentralized, globalized system. We're going to see its fragility and it break down. And then what we're going to observe is the already existing cultures in the different places of the world that will adapt themselves into new arrangements. And so where I am in Colombia is a good example of this. Let me give you a little bit of context. We're in the town of Barichara, which is a town of about 5,000 people. We're in a part of the Andes where there are 3 parallel mountain ranges. We're in the middle mountain range on the edge of an altiplano, which is just a Spanish word for high plain. So it's a large flat plain between the mountain ridges. And it's a place where there have been indigenous people for at least 13,000 years. And that when the Spanish came around the year 1500, all of the local people went extinct. They died from pandemics, and then they were actively exterminated in war and conflict by the Spanish. And so what you find when you come to this place is a colonial town, a 16th century colonial town with Spanish-style architecture and cobblestones, and it's really lovely and picturesque in the mountains. And then what you'll also see is a campesino culture of local farmers who know how to live on the land, who, through various forgotten pathways of history, practice indigenous practices. Excuse me. And they may not be the bloodline of the indigenous people here. But as one example, people here grow yucca. Yucca is a tuber that looks a lot like the root of ginger, but once you cut it open, it looks more like a potato. Excuse me. But it's got this like exterior bark looking thing on it. But what's amazing is you plant one of these in the ground, and then you wait 2 or 3 months, you walk away, and it's a harsh environment. You come back and you pull the whole plant out of the ground, cut off the roots, and that day you peel them and cook them and make an absolutely delicious staple food and a really healthy source of food. And then you take the tips of all of the branches where there are a couple of leaves on the ends of the branches, cut them off about 8 inches long, or maybe a foot long, stick them in the ground about 6 inches down with the leaves pointing up, cover the base of it in the ground and walk away. 2 months later, there will be yucca again to harvest. People have done that here for 10,000 years. So there are practices like this. So to say that this is a place that is a settler culture of a colonial empire is true and false. You see how there's this other culture that's here as well. It's true everywhere. So if you think about where you are, you're going to find some things that are different cultural practices. And they may not be historically indigenous, like this yucca planting, but you might find that there are some people doing permaculture in your community or other alternative forms of culture. And that there is actually a diversity of cultures that are coexisting in the place where you are. And this is how we see what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the most pathological expressions of culture, the ones that are the least future fit, are going to increasingly become problematic and break down. And the people who are either enslaved in them or entrapped in them, like they depend on them to make money, to get food at the grocery store, to send their kids to school, and all these things that are currently being disrupted, that some of those people are going to experience disruptions to their routines. And some of those people are going to start to shift to these other cultural practices because they already know them, or they have friends who know them, or they go online and watch YouTube videos and learn them. All these other cultures coexist in place with our information infrastructure that is distributed. And so you can start to see how much the breakdown of previous structure opens up the creativity to express different cultures. And that is something that ecologists call ecological secession. Just some existing structure that's unstable. It takes root, but it prepares the environment for something that couldn't have survived before. And then as it dies and breaks down, it releases its nutrients to accelerate the growth of the species that can now survive because the environment has been modified. So think of the 60s and the counterculture movements of the last half century, and everyone thought they lost, but they didn't. They are just second stage secession, waiting for this monoculture to collapse so that they can compost it and accelerate their own growth. And that's what we call the regenerative movement. All these people that are going to be restoring landscapes and creating sustainable food systems and local water catchment systems and all these other things, those will spread in the compost of the dominant system. And that's what's going to happen. And you're going to be able to see it everywhere if you know how to look.
In producing this part of this episode, especially, The phrase that keeps on coming up for me, the old saying, may you live in interesting times, which is actually a curse. It sounds like a blessing, but it's a curse. And we certainly do live in interesting times. That is most definitely true. I feel like with this very last segment, I really had to feature Bayo Akamalafe as the final note to this very long part of this very long episode. I'll just provide a little background here very quickly of who Bayo is. Bayo Akamalafe is the author of These Wilds Beyond Our Fences. He is the executive director and chief curator for the Emergence Network, which is a post-activist project. He also describes himself as a husband and a father, and an international speaker, poet, and activist for a radical paradigm shift in consciousness and current ways of living. He is globally recognized for his unconventional, counterintuitive, and indigenous take on global crisis, civic action, and social change. When I contacted Bayo to do this interview, it was in the summer of 2020. He had released an essay closer to the beginning of the pandemic, a very, very long essay titled I, Coronavirus, Mother, Monster, Activist. This segment I'm going to be playing for you jumps off from that essay. What he states here in this essay is, one of the central questions I ask in this essay is, if there is indeed a war, do we really want to win it? What if winning is the worst possible outcome we could imagine? Do we want to come out on top, stamp out this viral enemy, and restore agency to the cold, ossified tentacles of the familiar? Are we sure this disruption is not what we want, what we've cried for in unvoiced ways? Should we not treat this opening as our grand maroonage, our fugitive departure from exhausted cotton fields? Nothing about this moment is romantic, and we should be careful about smoothing the hard and recalcitrant edges of this phenomenon to fit our ready-made narratives about the so-called deeper meanings of the pandemic. I speak of popularized stories about, say, the Earth's comeuppance, about the virus being on our side against the one percenters and the boomer generation, about the fall of capitalism or Gaia's revenge, about the way love always prevails. This isn't the rise of nature to correct everything that has been wrong. This isn't AWA battling it out with the extractivist corporations. Not exclusively. This virus is not a rescue for the factories that produce human intelligibility. It need not surrender to our appeals for everything to make sense. As such, I am very reluctant to offer an overview about what is happening, or to perpetuate those convenient stories because they tend to re-centralize humans as heroes in wait. If only we could get our act together, you know. Like some of the things that you were pointing to, I think near the beginning, like there's this couple paragraphs here where you're talking more about how we treat this virus. I thought the parallels that you were kind of drawing were between, the idea of the nation state and borders and the other, and how we I think it's pretty much everywhere in the world, I would imagine, especially where I'm speaking from in the United States, it's this like hidden enemy that needs to be obliterated, destroyed. We need to engage in a war against. And in a way, you're pointing to maybe this is not the right approach, or maybe that's not even the right way to say it, but that this approach has been used and has failed in every attempt that we've had at trying to other people or ideas or concepts or anything. We engage in a kind of conflict and a war with that. And we're doing that with this little micro, I don't even know if you want to call it an organism, but these virus, this very invisible, unseen thing. Some of the language around it reminds me of the language around immigration, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. And in a way, I think something that it was almost a trigger, maybe not a trigger, but something that made me kind of tilt my head was, you even say that, maybe this is something that I think right here you're saying that we cried for this, as in we asked in a subtle or unseen way for this thing to occur. And I understand what you're going for, I think, but I'm curious if you could elaborate on that, because I think many people, including myself, can be put off with the idea of us asking for a pandemic. As disruptive as this. Yeah.
Well, first, I don't think a militaristic, industrial, techno-bureaucratic nation state response is wrong. I don't think it's wrong. I wouldn't see it that way. I mean, who imposes the moral here on whether it's right or wrong? It's only within the assemblage that those ethical distinctions are made. So I just think it produces a certain kind of world.
Mm-hmm.
It produces a certain kind of world. And we can ask questions about that world that it produces, which is what I intend to do and keep on doing. That is, if we respond within this assemblage, again, to use the word assemblage, I'm being very specific. I'm referring to the discourse, the theories, the Deleuzian theories about assemblage, that we never act alone. We act as a network. Patrick doesn't act as Patrick based on Patrick's intentions. That's a very humanistic, atomistic, reductionistic way of noticing action. Instead, we act in community. And in community, I don't just mean in human community. I mean in a heterogeneous network of different kinds of things. Like our conversation now, I'm not just speaking with Patrick to fully account, and I don't think a full accounting is possible, but to fully account, or at least to attempt to account more beyond the human for how this conversation is happening, we have to take into consideration your mic, my mic, the laptop, Zoom, the capitalist system that created Zoom. So we're acting within assemblage. Assemblages are meeting each other, if you will. So the issue here is not whether it's right or wrong. It's what kind of world is this producing? If you respond within this nation-state techno-bureaucratic system, whose imperatives justified within the system, within the paradigm, is to kill the virus, is to first identify it. There are discursive traditions that have led to an identification of a virus as something apart, something other, something exterior to us, right? So it's not just there for the taking or there for the dismissing. We kind of create the virus as well. If we respond to the virus this way, we are likely, speaking in the language of probability, we're likely to reinforce a certain way of being in the world that ironically created the mess in the first place. So my invitation there is not to say, hey, it's wrong. It's just ask a more interesting question, that what are we doing here? And by we, I mean a thicker we than the human linear regime of seeing might allow us to notice. And then the issue about noticing that maybe this is what we've prayed for is the converse. The others, the flip side is interesting as well, because it tells us about what that really is. That when we seek things, we never seek things alone. Again, that's another implication of assemblage. That when we cry out for change, when we cry out for climate, a reduction in climate carbon emissions, when we cry out for a way to slow down and meet each other as if for the first time, we imagine it to be in a certain way, because we've been conditioned in the world, to think that we are the change agents. And so we create a manifesto, a blueprint for how we imagine the future to be. And then we work towards that future, which there's another story to tell about design and intentions here. But the world exceeds our intentions. And so to ask for anything, like to ask to go to a trickster, I think this might be a good way to put it in terms of archetypes. To beseech a trickster for a blessing is to have your bones broken. It's to have some part of your flesh taken away from you. It's not just tricksters. I mean, in the Bible, Jacob, running away from his brother, wrestles with God someplace in the wilderness. And then he says, I would like, not when he realizes that he's wrestling with God, he prays for a blessing. And God's blessing to him is that he smites his thigh. He literally breaks his leg. And God gives him a different name. He says, from now on, your name will be Israel. But that didn't happen until he broke his leg. What kind of a God would break your leg in response to a benevolent, request for a blessing? What kind of God does that? So I think once we move away from the sphere of the human, we're dealing with forces we do not understand. We're dealing with worlds and movements and emergence and fluid becomings that we do not understand. We even presuppose that our language is neat and convenient and concrete and tidy. And I like some theories of language, some evolutionary theories of language might hark back to the wolf howling at the moon, and how that is encoded in human tongues. So that even when we think we know what we're saying, we're speaking with the echoes of ancestral becomings that exceed the words in their units, in their unitary definitions and meanings. So that's what I mean here by saying that it's that we don't know what we ask for. Just thinking about that right now, I recall that another place in the Bible, Paul actually invites the Christians to pray with tongues, unknown tongues. I've had my problems with that. I'm a recovering Christian. I no longer practice the faith, but especially with the way it was practiced in my environment. But the idea to speak with groanings and moanings, things that cannot be uttered. In the Bible, also in the beginning, in Genesis, it says the Spirit groaned over the waters, like it was calling creation into being by mourning, by groaning, by things that could not be articulated. So this is the sense here that, we don't know what we're asking for. When we pray for carbon emissions to be reduced, we are not prepared for the worlds that we talk about, the more beautiful worlds that we talk about. We're not prepared for it. We don't know what we're in for. And to have a sense of overwhelm, is to meet a world that has its own imperatives. I feel at some level that this virus, not to allocate to it or impose upon it anthropocentric ideals or imaginations of some kind of unitary agent. But I feel that this virus has the effect of helping us meet ourselves as if for the first time. There's something godlike, goddess-like, Kali-like, the goddess Kali, who is also an agent of creation and destruction. There's something Kali-like about this virus that possesses bodies, uses bodies to spread itself, and yet slows down everything enough for us to ask new questions. So that's all I'll say for now.
Yeah.
We started the interview, by the way.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't really say just.
I like how we moved into it.
Just blended in, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, certain thoughts come up when you say that, which is, I think this question of what. Okay, so in the United States we have the CDC, or you've got the World Health Organization. You've got these experts that are talking about what needs to be done to stem the spread of this virus.
Yeah.
So they're saying, we need to shut things down, social distancing, wear masks in public, things like this. And particularly in the United States, because I definitely don't want to extend this outside the borders of the U.S. too much. But one of the reasons why it's failing so much in the U.S. is there's this outright denial and distrust in those institutions, right?
Yeah.
And there's even these really interesting, what would you call conspiracy theories, that this is a human-made thing, and it's meant to further this globalist agenda to enslave us and to maybe expand,
take away our freedoms,
expand the surveillance state, all of these things. And in a way, it's interesting because I know that there's a kernel of truth in that, although I think it's ridiculous to a great degree, and it's also harmful to others.
Yeah.
But that kernel of truth is that by by, you're saying that this virus is can raise certain types of questions about our place in all of this. And I think what happens is there's this general confusion about how to approach something like this, where, as you said, the very fact that we exist in a global socioeconomic system in which everything is now being traded and interconnected in a way that's never been possible before. The opportunities for these types of viruses to emerge increases, but that's pushed to the periphery of our consciousness. There's only maybe a small group of people that even consider that would emerge out of this. But to me, what I see is this is a fixture or a feature of a global civilization, that inevitably a pandemic would emerge, and that is a part of the deal, right?
Yeah.
And all of the measures to try to control its spread and all of this sort of speaks to this obsession with control. And so I think what's really perplexing for me is trying to maybe ask the deeper questions, but also, I don't know, knowing where to place my trust right now has been a difficult thing. Like, not that I don't trust the science of it at all, but I think what you pointed to in your essay was fascinating, in that the very nature of viruses themselves you use the archetype of the trickster in a sense with your writing. So I guess, I'm sorry, it's kind of a rambling thing there, but I think what I find most distressing about this time is the ways in which I think it just highlights contradictions. It doesn't raise contradictions, it just highlights what was already there.
Yeah.
And you think that, and what do you think about that as far as the virus being kind of a thing that raises or makes us look at things that we've just never been wanting to look at before?
Yes. Not even wanting to look at, but we're incapable probably of looking at, because I think of thought as ecological. Karen Barad will call it when the world kicks back, a phrase she has used, I think more than once. When the world kicks back. And another author would say that might agree that we're witnessing a shock to thought, and there's something powerful to notice here that I feel might help us understand or frame what is happening today. It is probably best told with the story of the Hibakusha. Have you heard of the Hibakusha before?
I have not.
So in 1945, a certain thing happened, August 6th, to be precise. And the American Empire, in its desire to win a war, dropped Little Boy dropped a nuclear weapon called Little Boy, and killed hundreds of thousands of people in Hiroshima. And 3 days later in Nagasaki. Prior to that, it actually did some testing at the Trinity testing site on home ground in the United States in Alamogordo. I think that's in New Mexico.
I think so.
July 16, 1945. So America first bombed itself before it bombed Japan. The first nuclear weapon was deployed on American soil, not in Japan. Many people may not realize that. But the deployment of that weapon in Japan created a new class of bodies. People who were irradiated just by being close to the explosion. The children of those who were irradiated just by being close to the bomb blast. The people were kilometers away, and they felt, of course, the effect of this bomb blast. They're called the Hibakusha, literally those who were close to the bomb, to the explosion. And there are a class of citizens in Japan today that that have fought for certain rights, that have suffered discrimination, because they're alien, if you understand what I mean. Their bodies are now testaments, continuous, tragic, textual embodiments of an explosion that still resonates, an explosion that still is exploding in their bodies. They're experiencing not just discrimination, but different forms of cancer, leukemia, and some other forms of cancer. And so the hibakusha were created in the bomb blast. But another kind of body was created in the bomb blast, but this time in New Mexico. It's called trinitite. Trinitite is some resource that was created when the blast brought up the sand in a swirl of anger and fused this new glass-like object, greenish glass-like object, and it's called trinitite. Looks like a crystal. It hadn't existed until the first nuclear explosion. So the hibakusha and trinitite. I feel we have just witnessed another nuclear explosion of the epidemiological sort. That the coronavirus was our modern day bomb blast, our modern day Hiroshima. And what it has done is that it has distributed this strangeness. Like the blast itself has created different kinds of bodies. It has disturbed everything in the room. It has thrown furniture about. Nothing is neat and tidy anymore. As you and I know, we are already asking questions about schooling and education that we never knew to ask before, or only just a small group of people were asking, right? It's now mainstream conversation in the United States. Do we send our children back to school? What would have been inconceivable before? UBI is on the table. Speaking about American exceptionalism, all these questions about agency and power, they're now brought to the center. I feel that this explosion is a crossroads event, and it has spread its confusion. We are now alien-like. We're now neo-hibakusha, if you will. And questions about who to trust are lively questions. I can't answer that question. But it's this unfurling of the umbilical cords with which we attached ourselves to institutions, like the family, like even marriage, to schools and nation states and all of that. All of those cords are weakening, are being exhausted. The bomb blast of the coronavirus has weakened all of that. And now, we're meeting ourselves as if for the first time. We're looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, is that how I look? Is this me? Like you just spoke with me about doing some work. That might be true for more people, even now, than ever before. People might actually be having dreams right now that are queer or strange. Not that dreams aren't queer or strange, but I feel that if one were to conduct some research into the dreams of the COVID era, we might find something remarkable, without wanting to interpret this and turn it into some kind of utilitarian device. I feel that the world, the atmosphere is alive with confusion now. So the question is about, who do I trust? Do I trust a conspiracy? Do I trust the science? Or what is the difference between the two? How do I recognize that the conspiracy theorists, the MAGA hat wearing theorists, have something of a truth in what they're saying, and hold that intention with the fact that empirical science has always been a node star for how we organize reality and how we judge or are judged to real. How do I hold these things? So these tensions are alive at this moment. And I feel how we close up, how we renormalize or reterritorialize is up for grabs right now. It's a portal that has opened. Now it feels we're now being invited to do something with it. The question is, what do we do with this fluid, liquid, explosive landscape we're in?
What a very strange episode this is. It's amazing how talking about the pandemic can bring up so many different things. Okay, I just want to state, just as like a disclaimer here, we're a year and a half into this pandemic. Vaccines have been rolled out. I've been vaccinated, and it's not over. A lot of the same issues that we had at the very beginning are still present. I'm living in a very privileged position here in the United States, and the way that the vaccines have been rolled out, the way that so many people in the world do not have access to them, really speaks to a lot of the things that were highlighted in this episode. It's like every point in this pandemic, from the very beginning to where we are currently, where we have vaccines that are good, they work, points to how broken everything is. And I guess that's the point. The point was to highlight all of those things in this very long part of this very long episode. And to also point to the ways in which these types of events that we're currently living through are openings. And that's all I'm going to say. I really just want to thank you all so much for being on this journey with me up to this point. I've enjoyed making these. This has been really good for me. I've said this already, but it's been really good for me to go over these episodes that I've produced over the past year and a half with this pandemic to make sense of everything. It's hard to see it when you're in the middle of it. But as I've picked through all of these parts and have really focused on this project, I've really been able to see things in a different way. And all of the voices that I've been able to gather for this thing, all the incredible people that I've met on this journey, it really just fills me with a lot of gratitude, a lot of deep gratitude. And a lot of that gratitude goes to you, the listeners, to those that support this work. And I'm going to do my pitch thing that I always do at the end of these things, which is to just tell you where you need to go to learn more about this project and so on. If you want to learn more about this project, if you want to listen to the previous parts to this very long episode and to listen to the future parts, which there will be more, you can go to my website, lastborninthewilderness.com. Everything you need to know will be there. If you want to support this work, there are a few ways to do that. The first is just by sending a donation my way if you see fit. You go to paypal.me/lastbornpodcast. You can donate there, or you can donate on Venmo by finding me at lastbornpodcast. Another way that you can support me more regularly, you can really sustain this work on a regular monthly or yearly basis, that is through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/lastborninthewilderness. Go there, you'll gain early access to these interviews and some other exclusive content there as well. To all the patrons, thank you so much. You've been carrying me through all this work, financially speaking, at least, and in many other ways as well. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your attention, and be well.